1856 March 18th marked the beginning of a life that would eventually carve a bloody scar across the American frontier, starting innocuously enough in the river city of Wheeling, Virginia. The Ohio River churned brown and cold past the bustling wharves where steamboats belched thick, black coal smoke into the gray sky, coating the wooden buildings and cobblestone streets in a permanent layer of industrial grit. In this noisy, muddy trading hub, Stephen Decatur Richards entered the world, crying out with the same helpless urgency as any other infant, giving no indication of the hollow darkness that sat coiled within his nature. His parents, farmers by trade and Methodist in practice, looked upon the boy with the hope characteristic of the era, envisioning a life of pious labor and agrarian stability. The city of Wheeling sat on the precipice of the divide between the settled East and the chaotic West, a geographical reality that would mirror the boy's own internal division between the civilized mask he wore and the predator beneath. 6 years later, the Richards family packed their meager possessions into a wagon and crossed the river, migrating into the rolling hill country of Ohio. They settled in Monroe County, a region dominated by dense hardwoods, rocky creek beds, and a population heavily influenced by the Society of Friends, or Quakers. The environment demanded distinct physical resilience, where the days began in pre-dawn darkness and ended only when the sun dipped below the jagged tree line. Young Stephen adapted quickly to the rhythm of the soil, his hands hardening from the friction of hoe handles and the rough bark of timber. The community prided itself on pacifism and silence, valuing the inner light of the spirit, but Stephen found only a vast echoing emptiness where that light was supposed to reside. He sat on hard wooden benches during Sunday meetings, listening to the rhythmic breathing of the congregation and the droning sermons, observing the emotional displays of his neighbors with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying insects under glass. The Civil War raged to the south and east during his formative years, sending ripples of fear and economic anxiety through the Ohio Valley. While the battles seemed distant, the reality of violence permeated the local atmosphere. Men returned home maimed, missing limbs or eyes, telling stories of carnage that would make grown women weep. Yet Stephen listened to these accounts with a steady, unblinking gaze. He absorbed the details of grape-shot wounds and bayonet punctures not with horror, but with a factual attentiveness, filing the information away. The war taught him early on that the structures of law and religion were fragile dams holding back a reservoir of human savagery. When Confederate General John Morgan's raiders swept through Ohio in 1863, the panic that gripped the local adults stood in stark contrast to Stephen's calm. He watched his father and uncles hide horses and bury silver, noting how quickly dignity evaporated in the face of an armed threat. By the time he reached adolescence, Richards had grown into a handsome, strapping youth, possessed of a charm that seemed to disarm those around him effortlessly. He attended the local schoolhouse where he proved to be a capable student, learning to read and write with a proficiency that exceeded many of his peers. He discovered that words were tools, levers that could be pulled to manipulate the emotions of others. If he smiled at the right moment, the schoolmaster became lenient. If he feigned contrition, his parents' discipline softened. This realization was not a sudden epiphany, but a slow, calcifying understanding that social interactions were a game to be won rather than a connection to be shared. He walked the dirt roads of Jefferson County with a confident stride, waving to neighbors who regarded him as a polite, promising young man, completely unaware that he felt absolutely no kinship with them. Farm life in the 19th century required a necessary brutality that served as a training ground for his developing psyche. Stephen participated in the slaughtering of hogs when the first hard frost settled on the pumpkin patches. He watched the steam rise from the opened bellies of the animals, the copper scent of blood filling the cold barn air. Other boys often looked away or gagged at the death throes of the livestock, but Stephen wielded the knife with a steady hand. He found that the act of extinguishing life carried no emotional weight for him. It was merely a transformation of matter, a transition from animate to inanimate. He learned the anatomy of living things, how bones connected and where the major arteries lay, knowledge that was practical for a farmer but dangerous for a man with a vacuous moral compass. In the early 1870s, as Stephen approached young adulthood, the United States plunged into a severe economic depression known as the Panic of 1873. Banks failed, railroads went bankrupt, and the price of farm produce plummeted, casting a pall of desperation over rural Ohio. The hard labor of the farm began to feel like a prison sentence to Richards. He looked at the calloused hands of his father and the worn, tired face of his mother, realizing that the honest life they promised him offered only toil and poverty. The restlessness that had always hummed in the background of his mind grew into a deafening roar. He began to manufacture excuses to leave the farm, traveling to nearby towns under the guise of seeking better work or trading goods. But in reality, he was testing the boundaries of his independence. During these local excursions, Richards frequented the taverns and meeting halls where men spoke of the vast opportunities in the West. He heard tales of the Nebraska, of gold in the hills, and of land that could be claimed by anyone with the grit to hold it. These stories appealed to his desire for anonymity and dominion. In Ohio, he was known. His family history was a tether that kept him defined. In the West, a man could be whoever he claimed to be. He began to cultivate the persona that would serve him so well later, the harmless, talkative drifter. He practiced the art of conversation, learning to listen more than he spoke, gathering details about people's lives while revealing nothing of his own. He discovered that people were desperate to be understood, and if he provided a sympathetic ear, they would trust him with their secrets, their fears, and ultimately, their safety. A brief, failed courtship with a local girl in Mount Pleasant served as the final severance from his Ohio roots. He had pursued her not out of passion, but out of a desire to mimic the normal milestones of adulthood. When she rejected him, sensing perhaps the coldness behind his blue eyes or simply finding better prospects elsewhere, Richards felt a surge of cold irritation rather than heartbreak. The rejection confirmed his suspicion that emotional attachments were liabilities. He decided then that he would no longer abide by the expectations of his community. He packed a small satchel with a few changes of clothes, a razor, and a Bible he carried for appearance's sake, and walked away from the family homestead without a backward glance. He left behind the rolling green hills and the suffocating morality of the Quaker belt, stepping onto a train that huffed and hissed its way toward the setting sun. His first major stop was in Iowa, a state that served as a halfway house between the civilized East and the untamed frontier. Here, Richards took a position at the Iowa State Asylum for the Insane at Mount Pleasant. The institution was a grim, imposing structure of brick and iron, housing the broken fragments of humanity. Working as an attendant, Richards walked the corridors filled with the screams and gibbering of the mad. The air smelled of unwashed bodies, carbolic acid, and stale gruel. Most men found the work depressing or terrifying, but Richards found it fascinating. He observed the patients with the same clinical detachment he had shown the slaughtered hogs. He watched how the doctors used restraints and sedatives, learning that physical power was the ultimate authority. The asylum taught him that the line between sanity and madness was thin, defined largely by who held the keys. He saw men who had killed their families, women who had drowned their children, and he spoke with them, probing the dark recesses of their minds. He realized that society locked these people away not just because they were dangerous, but because they were honest about their impulses. Richards, however, had the unique ability to harbor those same impulses while maintaining a veneer of perfect sanity. He learned to mimic the doctor's authoritative tones and the patient's submissive postures, expanding his repertoire of social camouflage. He worked long shifts, restraining violent outbursts with a strength that surprised his co-workers, earning a reputation as a reliable, if somewhat quiet, employee. After several months in Iowa, the wanderlust struck again. The asylum had been a school, but it was still a cage. Richards drifted further west, taking odd jobs across the state. He worked as a farmhand during the harvest, tossing sheaves of wheat onto wagons under the blazing sun, his muscles moving with mechanical efficiency. He worked on railroad crews, swinging a sledgehammer to drive spikes into the wooden ties, the metallic clink echoing across the prairie. In the camps at night, he sat by the fire with men who had no names, drifters who had fled the law or their own failures. He listened to their stories of robberies and gunfights, nodding politely while he evaluated their weaknesses. He saw how easily a man could vanish in this country, how a shallow grave on the open plains could remain undiscovered for decades. The landscape itself began to change as he moved toward the Missouri River. The trees thinned out, replaced by tall prairie grass that waved like an ocean in the constant wind. The horizon expanded, becoming a flat, endless line that blurred the distinction between earth and sky. This vastness appealed to Richards. It felt like a physical manifestation of his own internal state, barren, open, and indifferent to human suffering. He crossed the Missouri River on a ferry, the water swirling dark and treacherous beneath the hull. Stepping onto the Nebraska soil, he felt a sense of arrival. The air here was drier, sharper, carrying the scent of dust and sagebrush. Richards did not immediately turn to murder. He spent time refining his skills as a confidence man. He would arrive in a small town, dress neatly, and attend the local church, introducing himself as a traveler seeking land. He would charm the local matrons and impress the fathers with his knowledge of scripture and farming. He would work for a few weeks, gain the trust of a family, and then disappear with a horse or a pocketful of stolen coins. These petty crimes were exercises, small tests of his ability to deceive. He learned that the greater the lie, the more likely people were to believe it. If he claimed to be a destitute orphan, people gave him bread. If he claimed to be a wealthy son waiting for a bank transfer, they gave him credit. During this period of drifting, Richards began to carry a revolver. It was a common accessory in the West, a tool as necessary as a knife or a matchbox. He practiced with it in isolated gullies, firing at tin cans and tree stumps until the weapon felt like an extension of his hand. He enjoyed the mechanical precision of the revolver, the way the cylinder rotated and the hammer fell. It was a device of ultimate control. He also began to carry a heavy spade, ostensibly for work, but he knew its potential for violence. The spade was silent, brutal, and effective. He traveled light, keeping his possessions to a minimum, ensuring he could leave any location within minutes if the need arose. By late 1875, Richards had shed the last remnants of the Ohio farm boy. The Quaker influence was now nothing more than a costume he could don at will. He had seen the darker side of American life in the labor camps and the asylum wards. He had learned that in the West, no one asked where you came from, only what you could do. He moved through the towns of eastern Nebraska, Omaha, Lincoln, Hastings, watching the flood of immigrants pouring in from Europe and the East. He saw Swedes, Germans, and Danes, families with pockets full of cash and heads full of dreams. Heading out to the remote homesteads where there was no law enforcement to protect them. He observed the vulnerability of these settlers. They lived in sod houses dug into the earth, miles from their nearest neighbors. If a man rode up to their door, they were obligated by the code of the frontier to offer him hospitality. They would share their food, their fire, and their roof. Richards recognized this hospitality not as a virtue but as an opportunity. He realized that a man who seemed harmless could enter the heart of a home without breaking a lock. He could sit at their table, eat their bread, and watch them with the eyes of a wolf in sheep's clothing. As the winter of 1875 approached, the wind on the plains turned biting cold, driving snow horizontally across the flatlands. Richard sought shelter in the bunkhouses of ranches and the back rooms of saloons. He played cards with cowboys and cattlemen, keeping his winnings modest to avoid anger. He never drank to excess, always keeping his wits sharp while others dulled theirs with cheap whiskey. He was a spectator in the chaotic theater of the frontier, waiting for his cue to take the stage. The solitude of the drifter's life did not lonely him. It empowered him. He was a ghost, passing through the lives of others, leaving no trace but a vague memory of a polite young man with a pleasant smile. The transition from drifter to predator was not a sudden snap, but a slow erosion. The petty thefts and con games no longer satisfied the deep, cold itch in his brain. He began to fantasize about total possession, about the ultimate power of life and death he had glimpsed in the slaughterhouse and the asylum. He looked at the isolated homesteads not as places of shelter, but as hunting grounds. The vast emptiness of Nebraska provided the perfect canvas for his dark artistry. There were no police patrols here, no telegraph wires connecting the soddies to the sheriff's office. A scream on the prairie dissipated into the wind, heard by no one but the hawks and the coyotes. Richards moved toward Kearney County, drawn by reports of rich land and new settlements. He rode a horse he had acquired in a trade that favored him heavily, his belongings strapped to the saddle. He wore a heavy wool coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. To the casual observer, he was just another pioneer looking for a fresh start. But inside, the void had grown, consuming whatever humanity had been instilled in him during those Sunday mornings in Ohio. He was no longer Stephen the Quaker boy. He was a vessel for something ancient and predatory. As the year 1875 bled into 1876, Stephen Decatur Richards stood on a ridge overlooking the Platte River Valley. The sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the snow-dusted grass. Below him lay the scattered lights of distant cabins, tiny sparks of warmth in the immense cold. He adjusted his hat, checked the cinch on his saddle, and spurred his horse forward, descending into the valley where the families slept, unaware that the wolf had arrived at their door. The transformation was complete. The Ohio boy was dead, and the Nebraska Fiend had been born. 1876 arrived in the Nebraska with a bitter, relentless wind that scoured the open plains, stripping the last of the dead winter grass from the hard earth. Stephen Decatur Richards rode into Kearney during the early thaw, a solitary figure against a backdrop of immense, crushing emptiness. The landscape here was not the rolling, wooded hills of his Ohio youth, nor was it the settled farmland of Iowa. It was a raw, exposure-filled expanse where the sky pressed down upon the land with a physical weight. Richards absorbed this environment with a cold, appreciative eye. He saw the isolation not as a hardship, but as a strategic advantage. In this place, a man could stand on a ridge and see for miles, yet remain entirely unseen by the civilized world. He drifted into the loose collection of settlements near the Platte River, his demeanor quiet and unassuming, presenting himself as a laborer seeking honest wages in a country hungry for strong backs. He established a pattern of movement that would define his next 2 years, oscillating between the rough, hastily constructed towns and the remote homesteads that dotted the prairie. He spent time in Hastings, a town that was little more than a grid of dirt streets and wooden false front buildings rising out of the mud. Here the air smelled of wet lumber, coal smoke, and the manure of horses tethered along the boardwalks. Richards walked these streets with a deliberate, measured gait. He did not strut like the cowboys who rode in flushed with whiskey and bravado, nor did he shuffle like the broken men who had lost their claims to drought or locusts. He moved with the efficiency of a machine, his blue eyes scanning faces and storefronts, cataloging details without revealing a flicker of emotion. He took work where he could find it, laboring in the brickyards where he hauled heavy loads of clay and fired bricks in kilns that radiated a blistering, suffocating heat. The work was brutal, stripping the fat from his frame and leaving only corded muscle. But Richards did not complain. He swung the heavy tools with a rhythmic precision, earning the grudging respect of foremen who valued production over personality. During the evenings, Richards frequented the saloons and boarding houses, but he remained a man apart. He would sit at a corner table, nursing a single drink for hours, listening to the cacophony of voices around him. He heard men boast of their cattle herds, their land claims, and the stashes of coin they kept hidden under floorboards or inside mattresses. He watched the card games, observing the tells of the gamblers, noting who won and who lost, and more importantly, who walked away with heavy pockets. He did not participate in the brawls that frequently erupted, often over perceived slights or cheating accusations. When fists flew and bottles shattered, Richards would simply step back into the shadows, watching the violence with a detached clinical curiosity. He was studying the anatomy of chaos, learning how easily men lost control and how vulnerable they became when ruled by temper or drink. To the locals, he was just Steve, a quiet, polite drifter who caused no trouble and paid his debts. This reputation was his most valuable creation, a shield of normalcy that allowed him to move through the community without raising a single alarm. By 1877, Richards had tired of the town labor and began to seek work on the outlying farms. He preferred the solitude of the homesteads where the nearest neighbor might be 5 or 10 miles away. He worked as a hired hand for various families, fixing sod roofs, digging wells, and tending to livestock. It was during this time that he truly began to understand the architecture of the sod house, the primary dwelling of the Nebraska pioneer. These structures were cut directly from the earth, blocks of grass and roots stacked like bricks to form thick insulating walls. Inside they were dark and smelled permanently of damp soil. Richards noted how sound was dampened within these earthen walls, how a cry for help would be swallowed by the dirt and the wind outside. He learned the rhythms of farm life, the early rising before dawn, the heavy meals at midday, the exhaustion that set in by sunset. He saw how the settlers lived on the razor's edge of survival, their lives dictated by the weather and the crops. He saw their fragility. He moved from farm to farm, never staying long enough to wear out his welcome, but always long enough to learn the layout of the land. He rode the section lines, memorizing the geography of Kearney County. He knew which dry creek beds could hide a rider, which ridges offered the best vantage points, and which trails were traveled frequently and which were forgotten. He created a mental map of the territory, marking the locations of the most isolated families. He paid particular attention to the households that lacked adult men, or where the men were old or infirm. He was a wolf counting the sheep, waiting for the shepherd to look away. He carried his revolver, a heavy piece of steel that he kept clean and oiled, tucked out of sight but always within reach. He practiced with it in the deep gullies where the sound of the shots would not carry, firing at fence posts and rocks until he could hit a target without conscious thought. It was in the early months of 1878 that Richards' path crossed with the Harlson family. The Harlson homestead was a quintessential example of the isolated pioneer life Richards had been observing. Located in a remote section of the county, the sod house sat alone on a rise of ground, surrounded by a sea of prairie grass that rippled under the constant wind. Mary L. Harlson lived there with her 3 children, struggling to maintain the claim in the absence of a husband. Richards arrived at her door initially as he had at many others, hat in hand, offering his labor in exchange for a meal or a small wage. Mary, worn down by the ceaseless demands of the frontier, saw a strong, polite young man who spoke with the diction of an educated Easterner. She hired him to help with the heavy spring chores, unaware that she was inviting a predator into the heart of her sanctuary. Richards integrated himself into the Harlesson household with terrifying ease. He was not just a worker, he became a fixture. He repaired the corral fences that had been knocked down by winter storms, his hammer driving nails with steady, powerful strokes. He tilled the garden plot, turning over the heavy sod so Mary could plant her vegetables. He charmed the children, 10-year-old Daisy, 4-year-old Mabel, and 2-year-old Jasper. Not with genuine affection, but with the calculated indulgence of a man taming wild animals. He brought them small trinkets from town, whittled wooden toys for them by the fire, and told them stories that made their eyes go wide. To them he was a source of entertainment and stability. To Mary he was a necessary resource, a man who could do the work that was too heavy for her. Richard sensed her relief, her growing dependence on him, and he fed it. He made himself indispensable. He moved his few belongings into the soddy, sleeping in a corner or sometimes in the barn when the weather was mild. Living in such close quarters, Richards observed the intimate details of the family's existence. He watched Mary count her money, a small collection of bills and coins she kept hidden in a tin or tucked between the pages of a book. He noted that she had no visitors, that her connection to the outside world was tenuous at best. He listened to her talk about her neighbors, learning who was nearby and who was distant. One neighbor in particular, a Swede named Peter Anderson, came up in conversation often. Anderson was a successful farmer with a reputation for having money, and he lived just close enough to be a concern but far enough away to be unaware of daily happenings. Richards filed the name Anderson away in his mind, alongside the location of Mary's savings and the schedule of the local patrols. Throughout the summer of 1878, the dynamic in the sod house shifted subtly. Richards began to assume a more dominant role. He no longer asked what needed to be done. He directed the work. He handled the sale of small livestock, dealing with traders who passed through, pocketing a few coins here and there as a commission that he never mentioned to Mary. He began to view the property not as his employer's but as his own in waiting. He looked at the cattle and calculated their market value. He looked at the land and thought about how easily a deed could be forged. The mask of the harmless drifter remained firmly in place, but behind it, the cold logic of the killer was finalizing the equation. He felt no hatred for the Harlessons, no flash of hot anger. They were simply occupants of a space he intended to possess, obstacles that needed to be removed to clear the path for his own gain. Richards also spent time cultivating a relationship with the neighbor, Peter Anderson. He would ride over to Anderson's place, ostensibly to borrow a tool or share news, but in reality to assess the man. Anderson was different from Mary. He was suspicious, guarded, and physically imposing. Richards played the role of the deferential younger man, listening to Anderson's complaints about the government and the weather, nodding in agreement while his eyes scanned the room for weapons, for exits, for places where money might be hidden. He recognized that Anderson would be a harder target than the Harlessons, requiring a different approach. He planted seeds of discord between Anderson and other neighbors, subtle lies meant to isolate the Swede further. He wanted to ensure that when the time came, no one would be surprised if Anderson suddenly disappeared or met with misfortune. As September turned to October in 1878, the tension in Richards grew. The days were getting shorter, the nights colder. The seasonal shift triggered a biological imperative in him, a need to secure his position before the deep freeze of winter set in. He knew he could not spend another winter as a hired hand, sleeping in drafty barns and eating at someone else's table. He wanted the house. He wanted the warmth, the food, and the silence of sole ownership. He began to test the boundaries of his control. He would stare at Mary when she wasn't looking, imagining the act of violence, visualizing the mechanics of it. He checked the weight of the axe he used for chopping wood, feeling the balance of the handle, the density of the iron head. It was a common tool, present in every household, innocent until it wasn't. He also began to isolate the family systematically. When travelers stopped by asking for directions or water, Richards would meet them at the gate, preventing them from coming to the door. He would tell them that the family was sick with a fever, or that the woman of the house was resting and not to be disturbed. He was erecting a wall of invisibility around the soddy, ensuring that the outside world's memory of the Harlesons began to fade even while they were still alive. He intercepted mail, if there was any, and discouraged Mary from making trips into town, citing the bad weather or the condition of the horses. He was shrinking their world until it consisted only of the four walls of the sod house and him. The physical environment of the plains in October was stark and gray. The vibrant greens of summer had faded to brown and tan. The wind rattled the dry corn stalks in the small garden patch, a dry, scratching sound like skeletal fingers. Richard spent hours outside, ostensibly working but often just standing and watching the horizon. He was checking for patterns, the time the mail carrier passed on the distant road, the days the neighbors went to market. He needed a window of time, a stretch of days where absolute privacy was guaranteed. He calculated that early November would be ideal. The harvest would be done, the roads would be emptier, and people would be hunkering down for the season. In the final days of October, Richard's behavior became even more solicitous. He was helpful, attentive, and polite. He played games with the children, lifting little Jasper onto his shoulders, letting Mabel braid piece of rope while he held the end. He watched them with a terrifying blankness, knowing that these small bodies were warm and full of life now, but soon would be cold and still. The disconnect between his actions and his intent was absolute. There was no internal conflict, no voice of conscience whispering in his ear. There was only the plan. He cleaned the house with Mary, scrubbing the floors, organizing the pantry, acts that seemed domestic but were actually preparatory. He was organizing his future living space, deciding what he would keep and what he would discard. He sat by the fire in the evenings of late October, whittling a stick, the shavings curling onto the dirt floor. Mary would be sewing, the children sleeping in their beds. The firelight cast long, flickering shadows against the sod walls. Richards would look at the back of Mary's neck as she bent over her work, identifying the vertebrae, the vulnerable point where the spine met the skull. He measured the distance from his chair to hers, calculating the steps required to close the gap. He checked the position of the heavy spade near the door. Every object in the room was evaluated for its lethal potential. The domestic scene was a facade, a thin skin stretched over a reservoir of impending violence. On one of his last trips to town before the end of the month, Richards purchased ammunition for his revolver and a few other supplies. He spoke to the store clerk with his usual easy charm, mentioning that he might be traveling soon, heading further west or perhaps back east. He was laying the groundwork for his disappearance, or rather, the disappearance of the man he was currently pretending to be. He walked out of the store and into the chill October air, feeling the electric hum of anticipation. The waiting was almost over. The long apprenticeship of the drifter, the years of watching and learning and simulating humanity were coming to a fruition. He returned to the Harleson homestead as the sun was setting. The sky a bruised purple and black. The wind was picking up, howling across the open miles of grass. He stabled his horse, checked the animals, and walked toward the sod house where the warm yellow light of a lantern spilled from the window. He paused at the door, his hand on the latch. Inside, the family was preparing for bed, unaware that the shadow that had been cast upon their lives 2 years ago was now standing on their threshold, ready to engulf them completely. Richards took a breath of the cold, clean air, pushed the door open, and stepped inside, closing it firmly against the night. The stage was set, the actors were in place, and the time for the harmless drifter to exit was at hand. November 1st, 1878 arrived not with a burst of sunlight, but with a dull, heavy grayness that pressed against the single window of the sod house. The wind had died down during the night, leaving a silence so absolute it felt physical, a vacuum waiting to be filled. Inside the earthen walls, the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, stale bedding, and the rhythmic breathing of 4 sleeping people. Stephen Decatur Richards lay awake on his pallet in the corner, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. He had slept soundly, untroubled by the proximity of the family he intended to destroy, or the magnitude of the act he was about to commit. His mind was clear, organized, and devoid of hesitation. He listened to the soft rustling of Mary L. Harrelson shifting in the bed she shared with her children, Daisy, Mabel, and little Jasper. To Richards, these sounds were not the comforting noises of life. They were simply the mechanical operations of biological machines that were no longer necessary for his plans. He rose from the pallet, moving with a deliberate slowness to avoid creaking the floorboards. The soddy was cold, the fire having burned down to embers overnight. Richards pulled on his boots, lacing them tight, and buttoned his heavy wool coat. He looked at his hands, flexing the fingers to ensure they were warm and dexterous. He needed precision today. He walked to the corner of the room where the tools were kept, his gaze fixing on the axe that leaned against the wall. It was a standard felling axe, the handle smooth hickory, the head heavy iron with a blade he had sharpened himself days prior. He picked it up, feeling the familiar weight. It was balanced and lethal. He did not feel a surge of adrenaline or a flutter of nervousness. He felt only the calm focus of a laborer picking up a shovel to begin a day's work. Richards approached the bed. Mary was the primary threat, the only adult, the only one capable of offering meaningful resistance. She lay, on her side, her face turned toward the wall, her breathing deep and even. The children were tucked around her, a tangle of small limbs and quilts. Richard stood over them for a long moment, simply observing. He calculated the angle of the swing, ensuring he would not strike the wall or the low ceiling. He adjusted his grip on the handle, sliding his hands apart for leverage. He took a breath, held it, and brought the axe down. The sound of the impact was dull and wet, a sickening thud that terminated the silence of the morning. The blade struck Mary in the head, cleaving bone and destroying the brain instantly. There was no scream, no thrashing, no moment of realization. Her life ended in the time it took for the metal to meet the skull. The sudden violence, however, created a shockwave in the small room. The noise of the strike and the shift of the mattress roused the children. Daisy, the eldest at 10 years old, sat up, her eyes wide and uncomprehending. She saw Richard standing there, the axe in his hand, and the dark ruin of her mother's head. Before she could draw breath to scream, Richards moved. He did not offer her a moment to process the horror. He swung the axe again, a short, chopping blow that silenced her forever. The efficiency of the violence was terrifying. He was not striking out of anger. He was simply extinguishing lights, one by one. The 2 younger children, Mabel and Jasper, were now awake, their small voices rising in confusion and terror. The smell of blood, copper and sharp, began to fill the small space. Richards dropped the axe now. The quarters were too close, the targets too small. He reached for them with his bare hands and the heavy spade that stood nearby. The next few minutes were a blur of kinetic energy and brutality. Richards moved with the speed of a predator, silencing the cries that threatened to breach the walls of the soddy. He did not speak to them. He did not tell them to be quiet. He simply acted. He grabbed the little boy Jasper, who was wailing now, a high-pitched sound that grated on Richard's nerves. He ended the noise with a ruthless application of force, using the wall and the floor as anvils. Mabel followed seconds later. It was a massacre of absolute dominance. Within 5 minutes of Richards picking up the axe, the Harlson family was gone. The only sound remaining was the crackling of the dying fire and Richard's own respiration, steady and controlled. He stood in the center of the room, surveying his work. The bed was a wreckage of red-soaked quilts and still forms. The floor was slick. Most men would have retched or fled in panic, but Richards felt a strange, grounding sense of accomplishment. The obstacle was removed. The property was his. But the work was not finished. The concealment phase had to begin immediately. He knew the sun would be fully up soon, and while the location was isolated, he could not risk a chance visitor seeing the carnage. He needed to get the bodies underground. Richards found an old piece of canvas tarp in the corner and spread it on the floor. He began the grim task of moving the bodies. He handled them with the same detachment one would handle sacks of grain. He lifted Mary's body first, wrapping her in the bedding she had died in to soak up the blood, and placed her on the tarp. He placed the children next to her, their small bodies limp and heavy. He dragged the bundle toward the back door, the heavy fabric hissing against the wooden floorboards. He opened the door and stepped out into the biting November wind. The prairie stretched out endlessly, brown and indifferent. He scanned the horizon, 360 degrees of nothingness. He was alone. He dragged the bodies to a spot he had pre-selected, a natural depression in the earth near a large haystack roughly 100 yards from the house. The haystack would provide cover from the road and eventually serve as the camouflage for the grave. He retrieved the spade from the house, the same tool he had used moments ago as a weapon, and began to dig. The ground was hard, the frost beginning to knit the soil together, but Richards was a man of immense physical strength. He drove the blade into the earth, cutting through the sod and tossing the heavy clods aside. He dug for over an hour, sweat cooling on his skin in the frigid air. He did not dig individual graves. A single trench was more efficient. He made it deep enough to discourage scavengers, but shallow enough to be finished quickly. When the hole was sufficient, he rolled the bodies in. He arranged them with a cold pragmatism, fitting them together to minimize the space needed. He threw the blood-soaked quilts in with them, along with the clothes they had been wearing. He wanted nothing left in the house that carried the stain of the event. Covering the grave required more care. He shoveled the dirt back in, breaking up the larger clods to ensure the fill was even. He tamped the earth down with his boots, walking back and forth over the spot until it was firm. Then he took a pitchfork and began to dismantle the side of the haystack. He threw forkfuls of old gray hay over the fresh earth, spreading it thick and wide. He scattered loose straw around the perimeter to blend the edges. When he was finished, the grave was invisible, buried beneath a mound of feed that looked as if it had simply tumbled down from the stack. Richards leaned on the pitchfork, breathing deeply. The Harlson family had vanished. He returned to the house to confront the interior. This was the most dangerous part of the aftermath. Blood was persistent. It soaked into wood, it stained grout, it lingered in the cracks. Richard stripped the remaining linens from the bed and threw them into the stove, adding kindling to build a roaring fire. He watched the fabric catch, the flames licking at the dark stains, turning evidence into ash. He heated water in a large kettle until it boiled, then mixed it with harsh lye soap. He got down on his hands and knees, scrubbing the floorboards with a stiff brush. The water turned pink, then dark red as he worked. He dumped the buckets far from the house in the tall grass where the liquid would be absorbed instantly. He scrubbed until his knuckles were raw, He inspected the walls for splatter, wiping them down with a damp rag. He turned the mattress ticking over, hiding the soiled side against the slats, planning to burn it later when he had more time. He opened the door and the window to air out the room, letting the cold wind chase away the metallic scent of death. By midday, the sod house looked remarkably normal. To a casual observer, it was just a rustic home, perhaps a bit untidy, but free of horror. Richards prepared himself a meal in the early afternoon. He fried salt pork and stale bread in the skillet, eating with a hearty appetite. The physical exertion of the murder and the burial had made him hungry. He sat at the table where the children had eaten their supper the night before, feeling no loss of appetite, no haunting presence. He was a creature of the present moment. The past was a closed room. The future was an open door. He drank coffee from one of Mary's cups, holding the warm ceramic in his hands, feeling the satisfaction of ownership. The rest of November 1st was spent securing the perimeter. Richards walked the property line, checking the livestock. The cattle were grazing calmly. The chickens pecked at the dirt near the doorstep. Life on the farm continued without a hiccup. He crafted his narrative as he walked. If anyone asked, Mary and the children had gone east. They had left early in the morning. He was staying on to manage the place. It was a simple story, boring enough to be believed. People came and went in the West all the time. Families gave up, packed up, and moved on. It was the rhythm of the frontier. Night fell early, bringing a darkness that was absolute. Richards lit the kerosene lamp, the soft yellow glow illuminating the room. He did not fear the dark. He did not fear the spirits of the dead. He believed that once the brain ceased to function, the person ceased to exist. There were no ghosts, only memories, and his memories were under strict control. He sat by the stove, whittling a piece of wood, the shavings falling onto the floor he had scrubbed clean. The silence of the house was now his companion, a heavy, comfortable blanket. He slept in the bed that night. He did not dream of the axe or the blood. He slept the sleep of the just or the sleep of the soulless. November 2nd broke with the same gray sky. Richards began the process of inventory. He went through Mary's belongings with the thoroughness of a merchant. He opened the trunk at the foot of the bed, sifting through dresses, shawls, and children's clothing. He set aside items that had value and could be sold. He found Mary's small hoard of money just as he had anticipated, a few dollars in silver and paper tucked inside a tin box. He pocketed it, the weight of the coins feeling like a down payment on his new life. He looked at the deed to the land, a piece of paper that represented legal ownership. He knew he couldn't use it directly, but he could forge a transfer. He had a talent for penmanship. Later that morning, he rode out to check the road. He needed to be seen to establish his presence as the caretaker. He saw a wagon passing in the distance, heading toward Kearney. He did not hide. He waved. The driver waved back, a casual gesture between strangers. Richards knew that being seen was better than being hidden. A man who hid had something to hide. A man who stood in plain sight was presumed innocent. He returned to the soddy and began to organize the livestock. He planned to sell the chickens and the cow. They were liabilities now, mouths to feed that required him to stay tethered to the spot. He wanted cash. He spent hours practicing Mary's signature. He found old letters she had written and studied the loops of her L and the slant of her H. He sat at the table with pen and ink, covering scraps of paper with her name until he could reproduce it with fluid confidence. He drafted a bill of sale, backdating it to late October. The document stated that Mary L. Harrelson transferred all rights and property to Stephen D. Richards for considerations received. It was a bold gamble, but in a territory where records were sparse and literacy was variable. It was a gamble he was likely to win. On the afternoon of November 2nd, A stray dog wandered onto the property, sniffing around the haystack. Richards watched it through the window. The animal was agitated, digging at the straw. Richards went outside, his revolver in his hand. He did not run, he walked with purpose. The dog looked up, growling low in its throat. Richards did not hesitate. He fired a single shot, the crack of the pistol echoing across the empty plains. The dog fell, kicking once before going still. Richards dragged the carcass away, tossing it into a ravine. He returned to the haystack and added more straw, packing it down tighter. He would have to keep an eye on the local scavengers. Nature had a way of trying to expose what men tried to bury. By the evening of November 2nd, Richards felt entirely at home. The soddy was his domain. He had erased the Harlesons not just from life, but from the space they had inhabited. Their clothes were packed away or burned. Their personal items were sorted for sale. The air in the house no longer smelled of them. It smelled of him, of tobacco, sweat, and gun oil. He sat by the fire reading a newspaper he had found. His legs stretched out toward the warmth. He felt a sense of power that was intoxicating. He had taken the ultimate step, crossed the ultimate line, and the sky had not fallen. The world was indifferent to his crimes, which meant he was free to commit them. November 3rd brought a change in the weather. The wind shifted to the north, dropping the temperature and bringing flurries of snow. Richards knew this was good. Snow would cover the disturbed earth near the haystack. It would freeze the ground harder, sealing the scent of the grave. He spent the day preparing for the next phase of his plan. He knew that simply staying in the Harleson house was not the end game. He needed to liquidate the assets and move on, or expand his holdings. His thoughts turned to Peter Anderson, the neighbor he had been cultivating. Anderson had more land, more cattle, and more money. Richards rode over to the Anderson place on the pretext of returning a borrowed tool. He found the Swede in his barn. Anderson was surprised to see him, but not suspicious. "Where's the missus?" Anderson asked in his heavy accent. Richards smiled, the lies slipping from his lips like oil. "She packed up yesterday, took the little ones to her sister's in Illinois. Asked me to sell off the stock and send her the money." Anderson nodded, accepting the story. It made sense. Life was hard for a woman alone. "She sell you the place?" Anderson asked. "We're working it out," Richards replied vaguely. "I'm looking after it for now." This conversation was the seed. Richards watered it with his calm demeanor. He spent an hour helping Anderson fix a wagon wheel, cementing the bond of neighborly trust. He watched Anderson move, noting his strength but also his slowness. Anderson was a bull of a man, but Richards was a viper. He knew he could take him. As he rode back to the Harleson soddy in the gathering dusk, the snow beginning to stick to his coat, Richards felt the hunger rising again. The killing of the Harlesons had not satisfied him. It had only opened his appetite. It was so easy. It was so simple. He arrived back at the dark house, the snow swirling around the chimney. He stabled his horse and walked to the haystack. He stood there for a moment in the cold, looking at the mound of snow-covered straw. "Sleep well," he whispered, a mockery of a benediction. He went inside, bolting the door against the wind. He lit the lamp and looked at his reflection in the small piece of mirror Mary had kept on the wall. The face looking back was handsome, calm, and utterly void of humanity. He winked at himself. That night, November 3rd, Richard slept deeply, the silence of the prairie wrapping around the house like a shroud. Under the earth outside, the Harleson family lay cold and stiff, their voices silenced, their future stolen. Inside, their killer dreamed of new conquests, of the money he would make, and the freedom he had seized. The transition was complete. The house was no longer a home. It was a lair, and the creature inhabiting it was just beginning to stretch his claws. November 4th, 1878, brought a dawn that was pale and brittle, the sun struggling to rise above a horizon line that seemed etched in iron. Stephen Decatur Richards awoke in the Harlson sod house, the silence of the room pressing against his ears. He lay still for several minutes, listening for the sounds of a household waking up. The rustle of fabric, the murmur of children, the clatter of stove lids. But there was nothing. The silence was absolute, broken only by the wind hissing through the dry grass on the roof. He threw off the heavy quilt and sat up, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The absence of the family was not a void to him. It was a completed task, a cleared ledger. He walked to the window and scraped a small circle in the frost on the glass. Outside, the prairie was brown and motionless. 100 yards away, the haystack stood innocent and mundane, a mound of feed that now served as a mausoleum. Richards began his day with the methodical precision of a man who had nothing to hide. He stoked the fire in the stove, adding corn cobs and dried wood until the iron belly of the appliance glowed a dull red. He found the coffee canister Mary Harlson had kept on the second shelf and measured out the grounds. The aroma filling the small room that had so recently smelled of iron and violence. He cooked a breakfast of salt pork and biscuits, using the flour from the bin and the grease from the jar, consuming the resources of the dead with a hearty, guiltless appetite. He sat at the rough-hewn table, the empty chairs around him standing as silent witnesses. He did not feel haunted. He did not glance nervously at the shadows. To Richards, the Harlsons were simply gone, displaced by a superior force of will. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of chilling normalcy. Richards assumed the role of the homesteader, performing the daily chores required to keep the claim viable. He milked the cow in the morning, the warm liquid, hitting the pail with a rhythmic pinging sound. He fed the chickens, scattering grain on the hard-packed dirt of the yard, watching them peck and scratch around the very path where he had dragged the bodies. He chopped wood, the axe rising and falling with a hypnotic cadence. The same tool he had used to dismantle a family now used to split oak for warmth. He felt a profound sense of ownership over the property. The soddy, the livestock, the land. It all belonged to him by right of conquest. He walked the perimeter of the claim, checking fences and surveying the dormant fields, planning how he would convert these assets into portable wealth. On November 7th, a neighbor named Smith rode by, pausing his horse at the edge of the yard. Richards walked out to meet him, wiping his hands on a rag, his face composed in a mask of friendly openness. Smith inquired after the family, noting the absence of the children playing in the yard. Richards leaned against the fence post, relaxed and casual. "Mary took the little ones east," he said, his voice steady and even. "She has kin back in Illinois she wanted to see before the deep winter set in. She asked me to stay on and watch the place, maybe sell off the stock if the price is right." Smith nodded, accepting the explanation without a flicker of doubt. People moved constantly on the frontier. Departures were as common as arrivals. Richards chatted with him for 10 minutes about the weather and the price of wheat, discussing the mundane details of life while the bodies of the rightful owners lay decomposing just yards away under the hay. The nights were long in November, the sun dipping below the edge of the world early in the afternoon. Richard spent the evenings inside the soddy, the oil lamp casting a yellow circle of light on the table. He went through the Harlsons' personal effects with the thoroughness of a census taker. He opened the trunk at the foot of the bed, lifting out dresses, shawls, and children's shoes. He evaluated each item not for its sentimental value but for its marketability. He set aside a pile of clothing that was in good condition, planning to sell it in town. The rest he burned in the stove, feeding the fabric into the flames piece by piece. He watched the fire consume the remnants of their lives, the smoke carrying the last traces of their existence up the chimney and into the vast Nebraska night. He found a small tin-type photograph of Mary and the children tucked away in a Bible. He studied the faces in the tin, the stiff poses, the unsmiling expressions typical of the era. He felt no connection to them, no pity. They were strangers he had known briefly and removed permanently. He tossed the photograph into the fire, watching the image bubble and blacken until the faces were gone. He slept in Mary's bed every night, the mattress ticking still indented from her body. He slept deeply, his dreams unburdened by conscience. The proximity of the grave outside did not disturb his rest. If anything, it solidified his feeling of safety. The evidence was buried, the witnesses were silent, and the world was none the wiser. By mid-November, the weather turned colder, the ground freezing hard as stone. This was a benefit to Richards. The frozen earth locked the scent of decay underground, preventing it from reaching the noses of passing travelers or the coyotes that yipped in the ravines at night. He checked the haystack daily, adding more straw where the wind had stripped it away, ensuring the mound remained uniform. He saw tracks around the base of the stack: fox, skunk, coyote. But they had not dug deep enough to expose the secret. He shot a coyote on November 14th, skinning it and stretching the pelt on the barn wall. It was a predator killing a scavenger, a hierarchy of the wild played out on the homestead. Richards began to make trips into Minden and Kearney, establishing his presence as the legitimate caretaker of the Harlson property. He rode Mary's horse, a sturdy bay mare, and wore a coat he had found in the house. In town, he visited the general store and the saloon, buying tobacco and ammunition. He told the same story to everyone he met. Mary had gone east. He was managing the claim; he might buy it himself eventually. The lie became a truth through repetition. He spoke with a conviction that disarmed suspicion. He was just a young man making his way, helpful and polite. He sold the Harlson chickens to a merchant in town, pocketing the coins. He sold the butter he had churned from the cow's milk. He was liquidating the estate piece by piece, converting a family's legacy into silver dollars. It was during this time that he intensified his focus on Peter Anderson. Anderson, the Swedish neighbor living 2 miles away, was the next logical step in Richards' plan. Anderson had land, he had cattle, and most importantly, he was rumored to have a significant amount of cash hidden on his property. Richards visited Anderson frequently in late November, riding over in the afternoons to share coffee and conversation. Anderson was a lonely man, isolated by his language barrier and his gruff nature. He welcomed Richards' company, seeing him as a rare friend in a hostile land. Richards played the part perfectly. He listened to Anderson's complaints about the government, the railroads, and the weather, nodding in sympathy. On November 20th, Richards sat in Anderson's kitchen, a room that was starker and dirtier than the Harlson soddy. Anderson poured coffee from a battered pot, his large hands shaking slightly. "You hear from the widow?" Anderson asked. Richards took a sip of the bitter coffee before answering. "Got a letter yesterday," he lied. "She's in Illinois, doing well. She says she ain't coming back. Wants me to sell the land and send her the money." Anderson grunted, looking at Richards with a speculative eye. "Good land," Anderson said. "Worth something." Richards nodded. "I'm thinking of buying it myself," he said. "But I might need a partner." He was planting the seeds of a business transaction, a lure to draw Anderson closer. Richards observed Anderson's house with the same predatory gaze he had used on the Harlson place. He noted the heavy wooden chest in the corner, the way Anderson glanced at the loose floorboard near the stove. He was mapping the terrain of his next crime. He saw that Anderson was strong, physically powerful from years of labor, but he was also slow and trusting of Richards. Richards knew that a direct confrontation would be risky. He would need to use guile, He began to formulate a plan involving a land deal, a way to get Anderson to sign over his rights before he was disposed of. November 25th brought a light snow that dusted the prairie in white. Richards spent the day inside the Harlson soddy forging documents. He had found a stack of paper and a bottle of ink. He sat at the table practicing penmanship. He wrote out a deed transferring the Harlson land to himself, signing Mary's name with a flourish he had perfected. He also began to draft a document for Anderson, a bill of sale that would transfer the Swede's property to Richards. He worked with the patience of a monk, ensuring the legal language looked authentic, mimicking the phrasing he had seen on other deeds. He was building a paper fortress to protect his stolen kingdom. As December approached, the isolation of the Harlson homestead became more pronounced. The road was empty for days at a time. Richards felt like the king of a desolate country. He spoke aloud to himself in the empty room, testing out different tones of voice, rehearsing the lies he would tell. He found that he enjoyed the sound of his own voice. It was the only thing that made sense in the silence. He walked the property in the evenings, watching the sun set in a blaze of red and purple. He stood by the haystack grave and smoked a pipe, looking down at the snow-covered mound. "You're keeping quiet down there," he said to the ground. It was not a statement of madness, but a statement of fact. The dead were excellent tenants. They never complained, never ate, and never told secrets. On December 2nd, Richards rode to Anderson's place again. This time he brought a bottle of whiskey he had bought in town. He poured drinks for both of them, the amber liquid glowing in the lamplight. Anderson drank heavily, his cheeks flushing red. Richards sipped slowly, keeping his head clear. As the alcohol loosened Anderson's tongue, he began to brag about his savings. "I got money," Anderson slurred. "I got enough to buy the widow's place." Richards smiled, his eyes cold and hard. "Maybe you should," Richards suggested. "We could work out a deal." He was maneuvering Anderson, guiding him toward the trap. He wanted Anderson to believe he was buying the Harlson land, to get him to bring his money out into the open. December 5th was a day of biting wind that rattled the door of the soddy. Richard stayed indoors, feeding the stove. He felt a restlessness growing in him. The Harlson chapter was closing. The excitement of the initial crime had faded, replaced by the boredom of maintenance. He needed the next peak, the next surge of power. He looked at the spade leaning against the wall, the tool that had done such heavy work. He cleaned the blade with an oiled rag, wiping away a spot of rust. He checked his revolver, spinning the cylinder. The mechanism was smooth and silent. He was ready for the next step. He began to move things out of the Harlson house, preparing for his eventual departure. He packed a saddlebag with the most valuable small items: silver spoons, a pocket watch, the forged deeds. He wanted to be mobile. If anyone started asking difficult questions, he needed to be able to vanish within the hour. He loosened a board in the floor and hid the bag underneath, a cache for his emergency exit. He was living two lives, the settled homesteader and the transient killer, ready to shed one skin for the other at a moment's notice. On December 8th, the tension between Richards and Anderson reached a critical point. Richards went to Anderson's house in the morning. The Swede was sober and grumpy, complaining about a headache. Richards brought up the land deal again. "I've got the papers ready," Richards said. "Mary sent them. If you want the land, we can sign today." Anderson looked at him suspiciously. "I want to see the deed," Anderson demanded. "I want to see the signature." Richards felt a flicker of danger. Anderson was not as dull as he seemed. "I'll bring it tomorrow," Richards promised. "We can settle it then." Richards rode back to the Harlson soddy, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't produce a genuine deed. The forgery was good, but would it stand up to close scrutiny by a suspicious man? He decided that the time for subtlety was ending. Anderson was becoming a problem that needed a solution. Richards looked at the sky. It was gray and heavy, promising a storm. The weather would provide cover. He went into the house and looked at the small bottle of poison he had acquired, strychnine, meant for wolves. He held the bottle up to the light. It was a coward's weapon, but effective. He pocketed it. That evening, December 8th, Richard sat in the Harlson house for what he knew would be one of the last times. He looked around the room that had been his sanctuary and his command center. The fire crackled in the stove. The wind howled outside. He felt a strange detachment from the physical space. It had served its purpose. He had lived amongst the dead for over a month, and they had not risen to challenge him. He had proven his dominance over the living and the deceased. He ate a final meal of bread and cheese, then extinguished the lamp. He lay in the dark, listening to the wind. Tomorrow would be the day. Anderson would die. The plan was set. Richards did not feel fear. He felt the cold, hard clarity of a predator who has spotted his prey and is ready to spring. He slept with the revolver under his pillow, his hand resting on the grip. The dead beneath the haystack slept on, silent and frozen, while their killer dreamed of the next grave he would dig. The harmless drifter was gone. Only the Nebraska Fiend remained, waiting for the sun to rise. December 9th, 1878 began with a silence that felt heavy enough to crush the roof of the sod house. The sun had not yet crested the horizon, leaving the Nebraska landscape submerged in a bath of cold, gray twilight. Inside the home of Peter Anderson, the air was stagnant, smelling of old coffee grounds, unwashed wool, and the sharp metallic tang of the kerosene lamp that sputtered on the rough-hewn table. Stephen Decatur Richards stood near the cast-iron stove, his movements precise and silent. He was not a guest here, nor was he an employee anymore. In his own mind, he was the executioner waiting for the condemned to wake. He held a small vial in his hand, the glass cool against his palm. Inside rested a white powder poison purchased days earlier under the pretense of controlling the wolf population that plagued the local cattle herds. He looked at the sleeping form of Peter Anderson, who lay on a cot in the corner, snoring with a wet, rattling sound that grated on Richard's nerves. Richards turned his attention to the stove where a pot of coffee was beginning to boil. The dark liquid bubbled and hissed, sending steam up into the low rafters. He uncorked the vial and tipped a measured amount of the powder into the pot. He did not dump the entire contents. He wanted the taste to be masked by the bitterness of the cheap coffee beans. He stirred the mixture with a wooden spoon, watching the white grains dissolve into the black brew. He felt no acceleration of his heart rate, no trembling in his fingers. This was simply a chemical equation he was balancing. A specific dosage of poison plus a specific biological organism equaled a cessation of life. It was clean, quiet, and required no physical exertion. He placed the vial back in his pocket and set 2 tin cups on the table, pouring the tainted liquid into one and leaving the other empty for a moment to maintain the illusion of shared breakfast. Peter Anderson stirred, groaning as he sat up. The big Swede was a man of immense physical stature, his shoulders broad and his hands calloused from years of gripping plow handles and fence posts. He rubbed his face, his eyes bleary with sleep, and looked at Richards with a trusting dullness. "Morning, Steve," Anderson grumbled, his voice thick with phlegm. Richards smiled, a facial expression he had perfected to convey warmth without feeling it. "Morning, Peter," Richards replied, his tone even. "Coffee is ready. It will warm you up against the chill." He pushed the cup across the table, the steam rising in lazy curls. Anderson reached for it, his large fingers wrapping around the hot tin. He brought the cup to his lips and took a long, noisy swallow. Richards watched him, his blue eyes unblinking. He waited for the reaction, the sudden stiffening of the spine, the arching of the back that signaled the poison taking hold. Anderson lowered the cup, grimacing. "Bitter," he said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Tastes like gall." Richards took a sip from his own unpoisoned cup, nodding in agreement. "New batch from the store," Richards lied smoothly. "They must have burned the beans. Drink it down. It will wake you." Anderson shrugged and took another drink, emptying half the cup. He stood up and moved toward the door to relieve himself, his heavy boots thumping against the dirt floor. Richards remained at the table, his muscles coiled, waiting for the fall. Minutes passed. Anderson returned from the yard, shivering from the cold wind. He sat back down and reached for a piece of hardtack bread. He did not convulse. He did not scream. He simply chewed the bread, looking out the small window at the brightening sky. Richards felt a cold spike of irritation. The dosage had been too small, or perhaps the Swede's constitution was stronger than that of a normal man. Anderson complained of a cramp in his stomach, rubbing his midsection with a frown. "Belly hurts," he muttered. "Must be something. I ate yesterday." Richards watched him closely. "Likely just the cold, Peter," he said soothingly. "Sit for a spell. It will pass." The morning of December 9th dragged on with excruciating slowness. Anderson's condition deteriorated, but not to the point of death. He became nauseous, retching into a bucket by the door, his face turning a pale, clammy white. He sweated despite the freezing temperature of the room. His muscles twitched involuntarily, his arms jerking as if shocked by a galvanic battery. Richards sat nearby, ostensibly offering comfort, but in reality observing the failure of his method. He realized that poison was a coward's tool, unreliable and prone to variables he could not control. He should have used the gun or the hammer from the start. Anderson looked at him, his eyes wide with confusion and pain. "Steve," he gasped, "I feel wrong, like my insides are twisting." By the afternoon, Anderson was bedridden, groaning on the cot. Richards moved around the house, checking the location of Anderson's valuables. He knew the money was close, likely hidden beneath the floorboards or in the heavy trunk at the foot of the bed. He could have killed Anderson then while the man was weak, but a pragmatic caution held him back. If Anderson died of sickness, it would raise fewer questions than a bullet wound. Richards decided to wait, hoping the poison would finish its work eventually. He fed the fire, keeping the room warm, playing the role of the concerned nurse. He brought Anderson water, which the man drank greedily, unaware that he was being tended by his assassin. Night fell on December 9th, bringing a darkness that swallowed the prairie. The wind picked up, howling around the corners of the soddy. Anderson's breathing was labored, a rasping sound that filled the small space. Richards did not sleep. He sat in the chair, whittling a stick, his eyes fixed on the dying man. He felt a contempt for Anderson's resilience. The man was refusing to die on schedule. This delay was unacceptable. It risked exposure. If a neighbor stopped by and found Anderson in this state, they might fetch a doctor. Richards knew he had to escalate the situation. He looked at the hammer leaning against the wall near the door. It was a heavy tool, the head thick iron, the handle polished smooth by use. It was silent. It was definitive. December 10th, 1878 arrived with no improvement in Anderson's condition, but the man was still breathing. In fact, he seemed to have rallied slightly. The vomiting had stopped, and although he was weak, his color was returning. He sat up on the edge of the cot, looking at Richards with a gaze that had shifted from trusting to suspicious. The mind of the peasant farmer was slow, but it was not entirely absent. Anderson realized that the illness had struck him only after Richards had prepared the coffee. He looked at the pot on the stove, then at Richards. "You put something in the drink," Anderson accused, his voice raspy but firm. I saw you at the stove. I never been sick like this. Richard stood up, tossing the whittled stick into the fire. The pretense was over. The mask of the harmless drifter evaporated, revealing the predator beneath. You're talking nonsense, Peter, Richard said, his voice cold and flat. The fever has gone to your head. He took a step toward the Swede. Anderson, driven by the instinct for survival, tried to stand. He was a large man, and even in his weakened state, he possessed a formidable strength. He lunged at Richards, his heavy hands reaching for Richards' throat. You poison me, Anderson roared, the anger cutting through his weakness. You try to kill me for my money. The confrontation turned physical instantly. Anderson grabbed Richards by the lapels of his coat, shoving him backward against the table. The lamp wobbled, casting wild, swinging shadows against the sod walls. Richards was younger and faster, but Anderson had the weight advantage. Richards brought his knee up, driving it into Anderson's stomach, exploiting the nausea that still plagued the man. Anderson doubled over, gasping for air, his grip loosening. Richards broke free, shoving the Swede away. Anderson stumbled back, crashing into the wall, shaking the dust from the earthen blocks. Richards did not reach for his revolver. A gunshot was too loud, too final in a way that announced itself to the miles of open air. He wanted something brutal and intimate. He scanned the room, and his eyes locked onto the hammer he had noted earlier. He lunged for it, his fingers closing around the hickory handle. He spun around, the heavy iron tool becoming an extension of his will. Anderson was recovering his balance, turning to face Richards, his fists raised in a clumsy defense. Get out! Anderson shouted. Get out of my house! Richards did not speak. He stepped forward, swinging the hammer with a two-handed grip. He did not aim for the body, he aimed for the head. The face of the heavy hammer struck Anderson on the side of the skull. The sound was a dull, wet crack, like a mallet striking a melon wrapped in canvas. The impact was devastating. Anderson's knees buckled immediately. The light went out of his eyes, replaced by a glazed, vacant stare. He collapsed to the floor, landing with a heavy thud that shook the floorboards. He did not move. He did not breathe. The silence returned to the room, absolute and terrifying. Richard stood over the body, his chest heaving slightly from the exertion. He held the hammer ready, waiting for any sign of movement, any twitch of a finger. There was none. The blow had been fatal. He lowered the tool, leaning it back against the wall. He looked at his hands. They were steady. He looked at the body of the man he had shared bread with just 24 hours ago. There was no remorse, only a sense of irritation at the mess. Blood was pooling on the dirt floor, dark and viscous. Richards sighed. The cleanup would take time. He began by dragging the body. Anderson was heavy, a dead weight in the truest sense. Richards grabbed the corpse by the ankles, hauling it across the floor. He opened the trap door that led to the small root cellar beneath the house. A blast of cold, earthy air rose up from the dark hole. He maneuvered the body to the edge and pushed. Anderson tumbled down the short wooden ladder, landing in a heap among the potatoes and turnips stored for the winter. Richards climbed down after him. He arranged the body in the corner, covering it with a pile of coal and dirt. It was a crude burial, but it would suffice for now. He climbed back up and closed the trap door, stomping on it to ensure it was flush with the floor. Richards then turned his attention to the blood on the floor. He used a bucket of water and a stiff brush, scrubbing the packed dirt until the dark stain was turned into mud. He scraped the top layer of soil away with a knife, tossing the bloody dirt into the fire. He was meticulous. He checked the walls for splatter, wiping them down with a wet rag. He washed the hammer, cleaning the iron head until it shone dully in the lamplight. He checked his own clothes, finding a few drops of red on his sleeve. He scrubbed them out with cold water. With the physical evidence removed, Richards began the looting. He went to the trunk at the foot of the bed, the one Anderson had guarded so jealously. He broke the lock with a pry bar. Inside, he found clothes, papers, and a leather satchel. He opened the satchel and smiled. Inside were stacks of currency and a heavy bag of coins. It was a substantial sum, enough to fund his travels for months. He counted it quickly, his fingers deft and practiced. He pocketed the cash, transferring it to his own coat. He rifled through the papers, finding the deed to the land. He took that as well, intending to add it to his collection of forged documents. Richards spent the rest of December 10th consolidating his position. He was now the master of two homesteads. He had the Harlson place and the Anderson place. He felt a surge of arrogance. He was untouchable. He made himself a meal in Anderson's kitchen, using the very stove where he had brewed the poison. He ate with a calm appetite, the violence of the morning having no effect on his digestion. He looked around the room. It was his now. Everything he saw belonged to him. He decided that he would need to leave soon. Two families disappearing in the span of a month might eventually draw attention, even in this desolate country. He needed to be a ghost again. He packed Anderson's best clothes into a bag, selecting shirts and trousers that fit him reasonably well. He took Anderson's coat, which was warmer than his own. He found a pair of sturdy boots and tried them on. They were a bit large, but they would serve. He was stripping the dead man of his identity, wearing his skin in a metaphorical sense. Late in the afternoon, Richards went out to the barn to check Anderson's horses. There was a fine bay stallion, a strong animal with good lines. Richards patted the horse's neck. "You're coming with me," he whispered. He checked the saddle and bridle, ensuring they were in good repair. He fed the animals, knowing he would need them strong for the journey ahead. He felt a kinship with the livestock. They were survivors, focused only on the next meal, indifferent to the morality of their masters. Richards returned to the house as the sun began to set. The sky was a brilliant bruised purple, streaked with red. He stood in the doorway, looking out at the vast empty plain. He had killed 4 people in this county, 4 lives extinguished by his hand. He felt no guilt. He felt only a cold sense of logic. They had something he wanted. He took it. It was the law of nature. The strong consumed the weak. He was the wolf, and they were the sheep. He sat by the fire, counting the money again. The gold. Coins clinked softly together. It was the music of freedom. He thought about where he would go next. Back east, perhaps. Back to Ohio. Or maybe further west to the gold fields. The world was open to him. He had the means and the will. He looked at the trap door. Anderson was quiet down there. The poison hadn't worked, but the hammer had. It was a lesson he would remember. Simple tools were often the most effective. The wind howled outside, rattling the window pane. Richards poured himself a cup of clean coffee, savoring the warmth. He was alive. Anderson was dead. That was the only fact that had weight. He leaned back in the chair, stretching his legs. He would leave in a day or two once he was sure the coast was clear. For now, he would enjoy the hospitality of the man he had murdered. He closed his eyes, listening to the crackle of the fire. A content man in a stolen house. December 11th, 1878 arrived with a biting ferocity that froze the breath in a man's lungs before he could fully exhale. The wind swept down from the Dakotas, screaming across the open expanse of the Nebraska plains, driving a curtain of ice crystals against the sod walls of the Anderson homestead. Inside, Stephen Decatur Richards moved with the urgent, calculated efficiency of a man who knew his time in a specific geography had expired. The previous day's violence was now a static fact, a settled account that required no further emotional investment. His focus was entirely on the mechanics of departure. He stood in the center of the room where he had killed Peter Anderson, dressed in the dead man's heavy wool coat and trousers. the fit slightly loose but serviceable for the arduous journey ahead. He checked the pockets one last time, feeling the reassuring weight of the stolen currency and the gold coins he had looted from the Swede's secret hoard. He extinguished the fire in the stove, dousing the embers with a bucket of dirty water. The sudden hiss of steam and the smell of wet ash signaled the end of the home's warmth. Richards did not look back at the trapdoor that concealed the body in the cellar. He picked up the saddlebags he had packed the night before, filled with provisions, a change of clothes, and the forged deeds he still intended to utilize if the opportunity arose from a distance. He stepped out into the pre-dawn grayness, the cold hitting his face like a physical blow. The world was a monochrome of white snow and black earth, the sky a heavy lid pressing down on the horizon. He walked to the barn, his boots crunching loudly on the frozen ground, a sound that seemed dangerously loud in the immense silence of the prairie. Inside the barn, the air was warmer, smelling of hay and animal heat. Richards approached Anderson's bay stallion, the best horse in the county. The animal nickered softly, sensing the presence of a human, unaware that its master was decomposing in the root cellar just 50 yards away. Richards saddled the beast with practiced ease, tightening the cinch and checking the stirrups. He slipped the bridle over the horse's head, the bit clinking against the animal's teeth. He led the horse out into the yard, the wind immediately whipping the animal's mane across its eyes. Richards mounted in one fluid motion, gathering the reins in his gloved hands. He turned the horse's head toward the east, away from the graves, away from the sod houses, and toward the iron rails that would carry him to anonymity. The ride to the nearest railhead was a grueling test of endurance. Richards kept the horse at a steady trot, preserving the animal's strength while maximizing distance. The landscape passed in a blur of brown grass and white drifts. He avoided the main road where possible, skirting the edges of the section lines to minimize the chance of encountering a curious neighbor or a patrolling sheriff. He was a ghost now, a spectral figure moving through the periphery of vision. When he did see a distant wagon or a rider on the horizon, he pulled the brim of his hat low and altered his course, using the natural dips and rises of the terrain to break his silhouette. He felt no fear, only a heightened state of alertness, his eyes constantly scanning the perimeter for threats. He reached the town of Kearney later that day, the buildings rising out of the flatland like a cluster of wooden boxes. The town was bustling with activity despite the cold. Wagons loaded with grain and supplies churned the mud of the main street into a freezing slurry. Richards rode into town with the confidence of a man who belonged there. He did not skulk in the alleys. He rode directly to a livery stable, dismounting with a casual air. He spoke to the stable master, a man with a beard caked in tobacco juice, offering a fabricated story about heading to Omaha for business and needing to sell the horse. The negotiation was brief. Richards accepted a price slightly below market value to ensure a quick sale, trading the distinctive bay stallion for a stack of greenbacks. The transaction severed the last physical link to the Anderson farm. With the cash in his pocket, Richards walked to the train depot. The station was a cavernous structure of brick and wood filled with the noise of escaping steam and the clatter of luggage carts. He purchased a ticket for the eastbound train, paying with the proceeds of his crimes. He sat on a hard wooden bench in the waiting room, surrounded by families, businessmen, and other drifters. He pulled a newspaper from a trash bin and pretended to read, using the broadsheet as a shield to observe the room. He watched the sheriff's deputies walking the platform, his heart beating with a slow, steady rhythm. They were looking for horse thieves and drunks, not a polite young man reading the daily news. He was invisible in plain sight, his monstrous nature hidden behind a face that looked like any other traveler's. The train arrived with a ground-shaking roar, the massive locomotive belching black smoke that mixed with the gray winter sky. Richards boarded the passenger car, finding a seat near the window. The car smelled of coal dust, stale tobacco, wool, and unwashed bodies. He settled into the plush velvet seat, placing his satchel on the floor between his feet. As the train lurched forward, the metal wheels screeching against the tracks, Richards felt a profound sense of release. The vibration of the engine traveled up through the floor, a physical confirmation that he was moving, that he was putting miles between himself and the dead. He watched the town of Kearney recede into the distance, the buildings shrinking until they were swallowed by the vastness of the plains. The journey east was a slow, rhythmic progression through the heart of the country. The train chugged through the Nebraska countryside, passing small depots and grain elevators that stood like sentinels in the snow. Richard slept in short bursts, his hand always resting near the revolver tucked inside his coat. He did not dream of the Harlesons or Anderson. He dreamed of Ohio, of the rolling hills and the river valleys of his youth. He was retreating to the familiar, using the geography of his past to hide from his present. He engaged in polite, shallow conversation with the passenger seated next to him, a dry goods salesman from Lincoln. Richards invented a new name and a new history for himself, spinning the lie with the same ease he had used to deceive Mary Harleson. He was a land speculator, he said, returning east to secure investors. The salesman nodded, bored but accepting, never suspecting he was sitting shoulder to shoulder with a mass murderer. By December 13th, the train had crossed the Missouri River, leaving the untamed territory behind and entering the more settled state of Iowa. The crossing of the river felt like a threshold. The water below was dark and churned with ice flows, a natural barrier that separated the lawless West from the civilized East. Richards watched the muddy water pass beneath the trestle, feeling that he had successfully closed the door on the Kearney County chapter. He was no longer the Nebraska Fiend in this new jurisdiction. He was just another face in the crowd. He changed trains in a busy junction, navigating the chaos of the station with the skill of a seasoned traveler. He bought a hot meal at a station restaurant, eating roast beef and potatoes with a ravenous appetite, the food tasting better for being bought with stolen money. The landscape changed as the train pushed further east. The endless horizon of the plains gave way to the wooded hills and fenced farmlands of Iowa and Illinois. The towns became larger, closer together, connected by a web of telegraph wires and rail lines. Richards felt the increasing density of civilization. There were more people here, more eyes, more laws. He adjusted his behavior accordingly. He became even more courteous, more unremarkable. He shaved in the lavatory of the train car, removing the stubble of the frontier, presenting a clean-shaven, respectable face to the world. He brushed the dust from Anderson's coat, transforming it from a farmer's garment into a traveler's attire. On December 15th, Richards arrived in Chicago. The city was a shock to the senses after the silence of the sod house. It was a sprawling, noisy, dirty metropolis, teeming with industry and humanity. The air was thick with soot and the smell of the stockyards. Richards navigated the crowded streets, moving from one rail terminal to another. He saw policemen on every corner, their brass buttons gleaming in the gaslight. He did not shy away. He walked past them with a steady stride, tipping his hat. He knew that guilt was a physical signal, a hunching of the shoulders or a darting of the eyes. By projecting absolute innocence, he became invisible to them. He spent a night in a hotel near the station, sleeping in a real bed with clean sheets. He counted his money again, organizing the bills into neat stacks. He was wealthy by the standards of the day, and he intended to enjoy it. He boarded a train bound for Ohio on the morning of December 16th. The final leg of the journey felt different. He was not just running away, he was running toward something. He thought of his old haunts in Jefferson County, of the people who knew him as Stephen, the Quaker boy. He wondered if they would see the change in him, if the darkness he carried would be visible in his eyes. He decided it would not. He had mastered the art of the mask. He would be the prodigal son returning, successful and worldly. He would tell stories of the West, leaving out the blood and the graves. He would be the hero of his own fabricated narrative. The train crossed into Ohio on December 17th. The terrain was familiar. Now, the limestone ridges, the hardwood forests, the winding creeks. Richards felt a strange nostalgia mixed with his cold pragmatism. This was the land that had formed him, the soil that had grown him. He watched the familiar landmarks pass by the window, ticking off the miles to his destination. He got off the train in a small town near the Pennsylvania border, deciding to cover the last distance by local transport to avoid arriving at the main depot where he might be recognized too quickly by too many people. He wanted to control his re-entry into society. He hired a buggy to take him part of the way, paying the driver generously. They drove through the winter landscape, the wheels crunching on the snow-packed road. The driver, an old man with a chatty disposition, asked about his travels. Richards regaled him with tales of the gold fields and the cattle drives, constructing a romanticized version of the West that bore no resemblance to the grim reality he had left behind. He was testing his story, refining the details, seeing what a stranger would believe. The driver listened with rapt attention, completely taken in by the charming young man with the ready smile. On December 18th, Richards arrived in the vicinity of Mount Pleasant and Steubenville. He did not go straight to his family's home. He checked into a boarding house using an alias, Mr. Gallagher, just to be safe. He wanted to assess the local atmosphere. He walked the streets of the town in the evening, the gas lamps casting long shadows on the brick pavements. He looked in the windows of the shops, seeing the Christmas displays, the wreaths and the ribbons. It was a festive season, a celebration of peace and goodwill. Richards walked through it like a wolf walking through a flock of sheep, observing the festivities with a detached amusement. He bought a new suit of clothes from a tailor, discarding the last of Anderson's garments. He wanted to look the part of a gentleman. He visited a local tavern that night. Sitting in a corner booth, he listened to the local gossip. There was no mention of the Nebraska murders. The news had not traveled that fast, or perhaps the bodies had not yet been discovered. He felt a surge of triumph. He had beaten the telegraph. He had outrun the consequences. He ordered a whiskey, savoring the burn of the alcohol. He felt invincible. He had committed the perfect crimes and vanished into the ether. To the people of Kearny County, he was a ghost, a phantom who had brought death and then dissolved. To the people of Ohio, he was just a stranger passing through or a returning local boy made good. December 19th found Richards moving with boldness. He traveled to the nearby village of New Alexandria, where he had acquaintances. He presented himself as a traveler who had done well in the corn markets of the West. He met with an old friend, a man he had known before his drift into darkness. They shook hands, and Richards looked him in the eye without flinching. "You look well, Stephen," the friend said. "The West agrees with you." Richards laughed, a sound that was rich and convincing. "It is a land of opportunity," Richards replied, "if a man has the strength to take it." He spent the afternoon walking the hills he had hiked as a child. The landscape was stark and beautiful in the winter light. He stood on a ridge overlooking the Ohio River, watching the dark water flow south. He felt a sense of closure. The Nebraska Fiend was a character he had played, a costume he had worn. Now he was Stephen Richards again. He believed he could compartmentalize his life, sealing the violence away in a mental lockbox. He did not understand that the blood he had spilled had marked him, that the law was a slow but relentless machine, and that the telegraph wires were humming with messages he could not hear. Richards decided to visit a female acquaintance in the area, a woman he had courted briefly years ago. He arrived at her door with a gift purchased in Chicago. She was surprised to see him but welcomed him in. He sat in her parlor drinking tea, making polite conversation while her parents looked on with approval. He was the picture of respectability. He spoke of his plans to buy land in the spring to settle down. He believed his own lies. In that moment, sitting in the warm parlor, surrounded by doilies and china cups, the frozen bodies in the Nebraska sod were a million miles away. Theoretical concepts rather than physical realities. As the evening of December 19th closed in, Richards returned to his rented room. He lit the lamp and looked at himself in the mirror. He saw a handsome face, clear skin, bright eyes. He did not see a monster. He stripped off his shirt and washed his face in the basin, the cold water waking him up. He lay down on the bed, his hands behind his head. He had successfully navigated the escape. He was safe. He was home. The anxiety of the flight had dissipated, replaced by a dangerous complacency. He closed his eyes, listening to the quiet of the Ohio night, unaware that the silence was temporary. He thought about the money in his satchel. It was enough to start over. He could go anywhere, New York, Boston, perhaps even Europe. But for now, he felt the pull of the familiar. He wanted to bask in the admiration of his old peers. He wanted to show them that he was not the aimless drifter they had dismissed years ago. He was a man of substance now. A man of action. The arrogance that had allowed him to kill was now the anchor that would hold him in place. Richard slept soundly on the night of December 19th. He did not know that back in Nebraska, a neighbor might be glancing at the silent Harlson house, wondering why the chimney produced no smoke. He did not know that the clock was ticking down on his freedom. He was the ghost of Kearney County, but ghosts are tethered to the places they haunt, and the past has a way of reaching out to drag them back. For now, however, he was simply a man asleep in a quiet room, dreaming of a future he would never live to see. December 20th, 1878, saw the first cracks appear in the facade of anonymity Stephen Decatur Richards had so carefully constructed. While the killer was enjoying the comforts of civilization in the East, the silence he had left behind in Nebraska began to speak. In Kearney County, the absence of the Harlson family and the sudden disappearance of Peter Anderson had finally curdled from curiosity into alarm. Neighbors, men and women who lived their lives by the patterns of smoke from a chimney and the movement of livestock, realized the stillness on those homesteads was unnatural. Sheriff William Martin, a man of sharp instincts and dogged determination, began to piece together the fragments of the puzzle. He stood inside the Anderson soddy, his breath visible in the freezing air, looking at the disorder that suggested a sudden departure rather than a planned relocation. The stories Richards had planted, the tales of visiting relatives and land sales, withered under the scrutiny of men who knew that a farmer did not leave his best stallion's stall empty without a word. The investigation moved with the slow, grinding friction of the frontier legal system. Sheriff Martin did not have forensic laboratories or instant communication, but he had the testimony of the station master and the livery stable owner in Kearney. They remembered the polite young man, the distinctive bay horse, and the stack of cash produced for a one-way ticket. The description of the traveler matched the hired hand known as Steve. Martin connected the dots with a grim certainty. The man who had been living among them, breaking bread at their tables, was not a drifter but a predator who had consumed his hosts. Martin secured a warrant and funding from the county, preparing to leave the jurisdiction. He knew the trail was cold, weeks old now, but the rail lines provided a singular linear path that a fugitive was forced to follow. Meanwhile, in Jefferson County, Ohio, the subject of this manhunt was living a life of leisurely arrogance. Richards had reintegrated himself into the social fabric of Mount Pleasant with terrifying ease. He was no longer the rough-handed laborer of the plains, he was Mr. Richards. The successful adventurer returned home. He stayed at the home of a friend, displaying the gold coins and currency he had stolen as proof of his prosperity. He told stories of cattle drives and land speculation, weaving a narrative of success that dazzled the rural community. He purchased fine clothing, walking the streets of Steubenville and Mount Pleasant in a tailored suit, a stark contrast to the rough wool and denim of his Nebraska days. He attended church services, sitting in the pews with a look of pious reflection, singing the hymns with a clear, steady voice while the money of dead men sat heavy in his pockets. Christmas of 1878 was a festive occasion in the Ohio River Valley. Snow lay thick on the ground, banking against the brick storefronts and covering the rolling hills in white. Richards participated in the holiday celebrations, attending dances and social gatherings. He was seen escorting young women to evening events, his charm and good looks making him a favorite among the local belles. He danced the waltz and the quadrille, his hands the same hands that had swung the axe and the spade, resting gently on the waists of the innocent. He felt a supreme sense of confidence. The West was a distant, savage world that could not touch him here in the civilized heart of Ohio. He believed he had scrubbed the blood from his history just as he had scrubbed it from the floorboards of the soddy. One particular evening in late December, Richards attended a ball in a nearby village. The hall was decorated with pine boughs and ribbons, the air hot and smelling of cider and perfume. The fiddle music was loud and lively. Richards laughed and joked with his old acquaintances, buying drinks and playing the part of the generous prodigal son. He felt superior to these people, seeing them as sheep who lived small, frightened lives. He had tasted the ultimate power of life and death, and it gave him a secret internal elevation. He watched the local sheriff pass by on the street outside, feeling a thrill of proximity. He was the wolf in the fold, and the shepherd was asleep. However, the telegraph wires were humming with information. Sheriff Martin was moving east, tracking his quarry through the records of the railroad companies. He stopped in Chicago, confirming that a man matching Richards' description had changed trains there in mid-December. Martin was relentless, sleeping on benches and eating cold meals, driven by the memory of the empty houses on the prairie. He contacted authorities in Ohio, sending descriptions ahead of his arrival. The net was beginning to tighten, though the fish swimming in it remained blissfully unaware. Martin arrived in Steubenville in late December, weary but focused. He met with the local law enforcement, Sheriff Anderson of Jefferson County, no relation to the victim, and they began to coordinate their strategy. Richards, in a display of hubris that bordered on madness, actually visited the Steubenville jail during this period. He went not as a prisoner but as a visitor, chatting with the jailer and looking at the cells with a morbid curiosity. He walked through the iron-barred corridors, making casual remarks about the strength of the locks and the thickness of the walls. It was a game to him, a way of taunting fate. He walked out of the jail a free man, breathing the cold winter air, convinced that he would never see the inside of such a place as a resident. This act of bravado would later be remembered by the townsfolk as the height of his cold-blooded nature. By December 20th, 1878, Sheriff Martin and the Ohio authorities had narrowed down Richards' location. They knew he was staying in the Mount Pleasant area, moving between the homes of friends and relatives. They decided to move carefully. They did not want a shootout in a populated area, nor did they want to give him a chance to flee into the wooded hills where he could hide for weeks. They gathered intelligence on his daily routine, learning where he slept and who he visited. They discovered that he was often in the company of two sisters, the dehumanizing reality being that he was likely scouting them as future victims or simply using them as camouflage. The morning of December 20th, 1878 broke with a heavy frost. The sky was a pale, hard blue and the air was still. Richards rose early, dressing with his usual care. He planned to visit a neighbor that day, perhaps to discuss a horse trade or simply to pass the time. He checked his appearance in the mirror, adjusting his collar. He did not check his revolver. He felt safe here. He walked out of the house, his boots crunching on the frozen mud of the road. He felt the sun on his face, a weak winter warmth that did little to cut the chill. He was walking toward the village, his mind occupied with trivial thoughts of dinner and conversation. Sheriff Martin and his posse were waiting. They had positioned themselves along the road leading into Mount Pleasant, using the terrain to conceal their numbers. They saw Richards approaching from a distance. He walked with a distinctive stride, confident and unhurried. Martin recognized him instantly from the descriptions. This was the man. The tension among the lawmen was palpable. They checked their weapons, ensuring a round was in the chamber. They stepped out from their concealment when Richards was within 20 yards. "Stephen Richards!" Sheriff Martin shouted, his voice cracking like a whip in the silence. Richards stopped mid-stride. He looked up, his blue eyes narrowing slightly. He saw the men blocking the road, saw the glint of steel in their hands. He did not reach for his waist. He did not run. He simply stood there, his arms hanging loosely by his sides. The calculation in his brain ran its course in a split second. To run was to die. To fight was to die. To surrender was to live, at least for now. A strange, calm smile touched his lips. "I suppose you are looking for me," Richards said, his tone conversational, as if greeting an old friend. He raised his hands slowly to shoulder height, showing his empty palms. The posse moved in quickly, surrounding him. The deputy sheriff stepped forward, grabbing Richards by the arm and spinning him around. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked onto his wrists, the sound loud and final. The capture was anticlimactic in its physical action, but monumental in its significance. The Nebraska Fiend was in irons. They searched him immediately, patting down his coat and trousers. They found the revolver fully loaded, tucked into his waistband. They found a significant amount of cash, the bills worn and soft from handling. They found a pocket watch that later proved to belong to Peter Anderson. Richards watched the search with a detached interest, offering no resistance. "You fellows are thorough," he commented. Sheriff Martin looked at him with a mixture of loathing and disbelief. The man before him looked like a choir boy, yet he was suspected of atrocities that would turn the stomach of a butcher. The group began the march to the local lockup in Mount Pleasant before the transfer to the county jail in Steubenville. As they walked, a crowd began to gather. Word of the arrest spread with the speed of a grass fire. Shopkeepers came out of their stores, women peered from windows, and children ran alongside the posse. They stared at Richards, trying to reconcile the polite young man they knew with the prisoner in shackles. Richards did not hang his head. He walked with his chin up, meeting the gazes of the onlookers. He nodded to people he knew, offering greetings even as he was marched to a cell. Once inside the Sion temporary holding cell, the interrogation began almost immediately. Sheriff Martin sat opposite Richards, a wooden table between them. "We know about Anderson," Martin said, laying his cards on the table. "We found the house empty. We know you sold the horse." Richards looked at the sheriff, his expression unreadable. He did not sweat. He did not fidget. He simply shrugged. "Anderson was a difficult man," Richards said. "We had a disagreement. It was the first crack in the dam." Over the next few hours, Richards began to talk. He did not offer a tearful confession or a plea for mercy. He recounted the details of the crimes with the clinical precision of a surgeon discussing a procedure. He admitted to killing Peter Anderson in a fight, claiming self-defense initially, but the details he provided, the use of the spade, the burial in the cellar, belied that claim. He spoke of the poison he had tried to use first, a detail that chilled the lawman to the bone. He seemed to take pride in the efficiency of his actions. Then the conversation turned to the Harlson family. Martin asked about the woman and the 3 children. Richards paused for a moment, looking at the ceiling as if consulting a mental ledger. "They are gone," he said simply. When pressed for their location, he gave a vague answer, testing the sheriff's knowledge. "They went to Illinois," he repeated his old lie. Martin slammed his hand on the table. "We know that is a lie, Richards. Where are they?" Richards looked at him, a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "You will find them if you look hard enough," he said. "The prairie is a big place." The news of his confession, partial though it was, leaked out to the public. The atmosphere in Mount Pleasant shifted from curiosity to horror. The charming Mr. Richards was a monster. People who had shaken his hand scrubbed their skin. Women who had danced with him felt a wave of nausea. The jail became a focal point for the town's anger. A crowd gathered outside, their murmurs growing into shouts. There was talk of a rope, of saving the state the cost of a trial. Richards heard the noise from his cell. He asked the jailer for a cigarette, seemingly unbothered by the mob baying for his blood. Sheriff Martin realized that keeping Richards in Mount Pleasant was dangerous. He needed to move him to the more secure facility in Steubenville. Under the cover of darkness, they transported the prisoner by wagon. The ride was tense, the lawmen watching the shadows for potential vigilantes. Richards sat in the back of the wagon, the chains on his legs rattling with every bump in the road. He looked at the passing landscape, the winter trees standing like skeletons against the moonlit sky. "It is a fine night for a ride," he remarked. The deputy told him to shut his mouth. They arrived in Steubenville in the early hours of the morning. The county jail was a fortress of stone and iron. Richards was processed, his name entered into the ledger. He was stripped of his fine suit and given prison grays. He was placed in a solitary cell, isolated from other prisoners for his own safety and theirs. The heavy steel door clanged shut, sealing him in a box of stone. For the first time since leaving Nebraska, Richards was truly contained. The vast horizons he had roamed were reduced to a 6-by-8-foot room. In the days following his arrest, reporters from local newspapers flocked to the jail. Richards granted interviews, reveling in the attention. He sat on his cot, smoking cigars brought to him by the scribes, and spun his tales. He embellished his history, hinting at other crimes, other murders in other states. He wanted to be feared. He wanted to be a legend. He described the killing of Anderson with a graphic intensity that sold papers but horrified the readers. He claimed that Anderson had attacked him, that it was a fair fight, but then he would smile, that cold, empty smile that suggested otherwise. He continued to evade the truth about the Harlson family enjoying the game of cat and mouse. He knew that revealing their location was his last card to play. As long as the bodies were missing, he held a sliver of power over the authorities. He taunted Sheriff Martin, asking if the snow in Nebraska was deep, if the ground was hard. "Digging is hard work in winter," he commented, a cryptic clue that the sheriff noted with a grim face. The legal machinery for extradition began to turn. The governor of Nebraska sent a formal requisition to the governor of Ohio. The paperwork traveled by train, moving back and forth across the country Richards had just traversed. While the bureaucrats stamped papers, Richards sat in his cell, a celebrity of the macabre. He received letters from strangers, some condemning him, some curiously fascinated by him. He read them all, tossing the condemnations aside and keeping the others. One afternoon, a local minister visited the jail, offering Richards spiritual counsel. Richards listened, politely, just as he had listened to the sermons in his youth. When the minister spoke of repentance and the fires of hell, Richards laughed softly. "I have seen hell," he said. "It is just a place where the weak suffer and the strong survive. I am not afraid of what comes next." The minister left, shaken by the absolute void he had sensed in the young man's soul. As December 27th drew to a close, the preparations for the return trip to Nebraska were finalized. Sheriff Martin had secured the necessary writs. He gathered a heavy guard, knowing that the journey back would be perilous. Richards was a high-profile prisoner now. There were rumors that mobs in Nebraska were waiting to lynch him as soon as he crossed the state line. Martin intended to deliver his prisoner to the court alive. He checked the shackles, the handcuffs, and the weapons of his men. Richards spent his last night in the Ohio jail, sleeping soundly. He had been captured, yes, but he was still the center of attention. The capture in the East had ended his spree, but it had begun his infamy. He was no longer a nameless drifter. He was Stephen Decatur Richards, the man who had fooled a town and killed a family. As he lay in the dark, he thought about the train ride back. He would see the plains again. He would see the places where he had made his mark. He smiled in the darkness, a predator anticipating the final act of his own dark play. The capture was not the end. It was simply a change of venue. December 28th, 1878, marked the beginning of a journey that would reverse the escape route Stephen Decatur Richards had taken only weeks prior. The morning in Steubenville, Ohio, was frigid, the air biting at the exposed skin of the lawmen who gathered around the county jail. Sheriff William Martin, accompanied by a heavily armed escort, prepared to transport his prisoner back to the scene of his crimes. Richards was brought out in shackles, the iron cuffs around his wrists and ankles clanking with a rhythmic heaviness against the stone pavement. He was dressed in the prison-issue clothes that offered little protection against the winter wind, though a heavy blanket was thrown over his shoulders. The crowd that had gathered to watch the departure was silent, their breath pluming in the cold air as they watched the young man with the handsome face and the cold eyes being loaded into the transport wagon. Richards looked out at them not with shame, but with a slight, almost imperceptible smirk, enjoying the notoriety that his capture had generated. The group boarded the train that would carry them westward, retracing the steel path Richards had used to flee. The atmosphere inside the passenger car was tense. Sheriff Martin had cleared a section of the carriage for his party, ensuring that no civilians could get close enough to speak to Richards or, more dangerously, attempt to harm him. Two deputies sat opposite Richards, their shotguns resting on their knees, barrels pointed at the floor but ready to be raised in a second. Richards sat by the window watching the Ohio landscape roll past. He spoke little during the initial leg of the trip, seeming content to observe the world he was being removed from. The train chugged through the industrial towns and frozen farmlands, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks serving as a constant reminder of the relentless march of justice. As the train crossed into Indiana and then Illinois, the news of Richards' capture traveled ahead of them via the telegraph wires. Crowds began to gather at the depots where the train stopped for water and fuel. Men and women pressed their faces against the glass of the station windows, trying to catch a glimpse of the Nebraska Fiend. At a stop in Chicago, the platform was swarming with reporters and onlookers. Sheriff Martin had to order the blinds drawn to prevent the mob from agitating the prisoner. Richards, however, asked for them to be raised. He wanted to see the people who had come to see him. He preened under the attention, asking the sheriff if the newspapers had printed his picture. When Martin confirmed they had, Richards nodded with satisfaction, remarking that he hoped they had used a good likeness. The journey became more perilous as they crossed the Missouri River and entered Nebraska territory. The mood of the crowds at the stations changed from curiosity to open hostility. In the small towns along the Platte River, men gathered with ropes and guns, their faces hard with anger. They had heard the stories of the Harlson family and the brutal killing of Peter Anderson. They viewed Richards not as a celebrity but as a rabid animal that needed to be put down immediately. Sheriff Martin was acutely aware of the danger. He coordinated with local marshals at each stop, arranging for decoys and quick departures to avoid the lynch mobs that threatened to storm the train. Richards observed these angry gatherings with a detached amusement, commenting on the lack of organization among the vigilantes. After the long ride west, the train finally hissed to a halt in Kearney. The reception was chaotic. A massive crowd had assembled, their shouts of anger drowning out the noise of the steam engine. Sheriff Martin, anticipating this reaction, had arranged for a carriage to be waiting at a side platform. He and his deputies hustled Richards off the train. Surrounding him with a wall of bodies and weapons, they moved quickly through the freezing mud, shoving aside the few men who managed to break through the cordon. Richards was thrown into the carriage, the door slammed shut, and the horses whipped into a gallop. They sped toward the county jail, the wheels throwing up clods of frozen earth, leaving the shouting mob behind in a cloud of dust and exhaust. Once secured in the Kearney jail, the interrogation resumed with a new intensity. Sheriff Martin needed to locate the Harlson bodies. While Richards had admitted to the killings in Ohio, he had been vague about the burial site. Now, back in the jurisdiction where the crimes occurred, the pressure was on to recover the victims. The public demanded it, and the legal case required it. Richards sat in his cell, smoking a cigar he had charmed off a guard, and played his final game of leverage. He negotiated for small comforts, better food, a fresh shirt, in exchange for information. Martin, his patience wearing thin, agreed to the demands. So, next morning, Richards agreed to lead them to the spot. A convoy was organized for the trip to the Harlson homestead. It consisted of Sheriff Martin, several deputies, a coroner, and Richards, who was heavily shackled and placed in a wagon. They rode out of Kearney under a gray, overcast sky, the wind howling across the open plains. The temperature was well below freezing, the ground hard as iron. As they approached the desolate sod house, the isolation of the place struck the lawman. It was a lonely, silent spot, perfectly suited for the atrocities that had taken place there. Richard sat up in the wagon, looking around with a sense of ownership. He pointed out the improvements he had made to the fences and the repairs to the roof, speaking as if he were a landlord showing a property rather than a killer returning to a grave. When they arrived at the yard, Richards directed them to stop near the large haystack that stood approximately 100 yards from the house. The stack was covered in snow, a white mound rising from the flat earth. "You will find them there," Richards said, gesturing with his manacled hands toward the feed pile. "I put them under the hay to keep them warm." The comment was delivered without a hint of irony or remorse. The deputies climbed down from the wagon, retrieving shovels and pitchforks. They began the grim task of dismantling the haystack, tossing the frozen straw aside to reveal the earth beneath. Richards watched from the wagon, criticizing their technique, telling them to dig to the left or the right. The ground beneath the hay was not as frozen as the exposed soil, insulated by the thick layer of vegetation. The men were able to break through the crust with their spades. After 20 minutes of digging, a shovel struck something soft. A deputy cleared away the loose dirt with his hands, revealing a patch of fabric. It was a piece of the quilt Richards had used to wrap the bodies. The mood in the group shifted from grim determination to horrified silence. They worked carefully now, widening the hole to expose the contents of the shallow trench. The first body to be fully uncovered was that of Mary L. Harlson. She was still wrapped in the bedding, the fabric stained dark with dried blood. The cold had preserved her remains to a disturbing degree. Next to her lay the small bodies of the children, Daisy, Mabel, and little Jasper. They were packed together tightly, arranged like dolls in a box. The violence of their deaths was immediately apparent even to the untrained eye. The crushing injuries to their skulls told the story of the axe and the spade. Sheriff Martin looked at the scene, his face pale. He turned to look at Richards, who was picking a piece of lint from his trousers, utterly uninterested in the excavation of his victims. The bodies were lifted out of the grave one by one and placed on canvas sheets spread on the snow. The coroner began his preliminary examination right there in the freezing wind. He noted the severe trauma to the heads, the defensive wounds on Mary's arms, and the small size of the children. The reality of the massacre was overwhelming. These were not just names on a warrant. They were a mother and her babies, destroyed and discarded like refuse. The deputies, hardened men of the frontier, had to look away, some spitting on the ground to clear the taste of bile from their mouths. Richards called out from the wagon, asking if they were finished yet, complaining that his feet were getting cold. The return trip to Kearney with the bodies was a somber procession. The wagon carrying the remains moved slowly, the canvas-covered mounds a stark testament to the tragedy. Richards rode in the lead wagon, chatting with the driver about the quality of the horses. He seemed energized by the discovery, as if the physical proof of his deeds validated his power. When they arrived back in town, the news of the recovery spread instantly. The mood in Kearney darkened further. The abstract horror of the missing family had become the concrete reality of 4 corpses. The crowd that gathered outside the undertaker's parlor was silent and sullen, a dangerous calm before the storm. Sheriff Martin realized that the Kearney jail was no longer safe. The risk of a lynch mob storming the facility was critically high. He made the decision to move Richards to the state penitentiary in Lincoln or a more secure jail in Omaha for safekeeping until the trial. On the night of January 24th, under the cover of a blizzard that kept most citizens indoors, Richards was smuggled out of the jail and put on an eastbound train. He was taken to Omaha, where the jail facilities were more robust and the police force larger. In the Omaha jail, Richards became a spectacle. He was housed in a cell that allowed visitors to see him through the bars. People paid to come and stare at the monster. Richards obliged them, standing at the cell door answering questions and posing for sketches. He recounted the details of the murders to anyone who would listen. He described the sound of the axe hitting the skull, the way the children cried, and how he had silenced them. He spoke with a chilling lucidity, using precise language to describe the carnage. He claimed that he felt no guilt, that his conscience was clear because he did not believe in the morality that governed other men. And in the days that followed, a reporter from a major Omaha newspaper was granted an exclusive interview. Richard sat on his bunk, his legs crossed, and gave a full account of his life and crimes. He spoke of his childhood in Ohio, his time in the asylum, and his drift into the void of the frontier. He explained his philosophy, stating that he killed because it was expedient, because the victim stood in the way of what he wanted. He dismissed the value of human life, arguing that all living things eventually died, and he simply hastened the process. The interview, published the following day, shocked the nation. It presented a portrait of a man who was not insane in the legal sense, but completely devoid of empathy, a moral vacuum in human shape. During the final days of January, the legal process began to grind forward. The prosecutors prepared the indictments. They had an abundance of evidence: the bodies, the weapon, the stolen property found in Richard's possession, and his own confession. The case was open and shut. The main concern was not proving guilt, but ensuring the prisoner survived long enough to be hanged legally. The authorities in Kearney demanded that the trial be held there, arguing that the crimes were committed in their county. The judge agreed, setting a date for the trial in the spring. Richard spent his time in the Omaha cell reading the Bible and writing letters. He wrote to his family in Ohio, letters that were filled with self-justification and complaints about the food in the jail. He seemed incapable of understanding the grief he had caused his parents. He viewed himself as the victim of circumstances, a man who had been forced to act by the harshness of the world. He complained about the cold in the cell and the rudeness of the guards, seemingly oblivious to the irony of his complaints given the suffering he had inflicted. Before trial, a group of doctors visited the jail to examine Richards. They were alienists, early psychiatrists, sent to determine his sanity. They measured his head, looked into his eyes, and asked him questions about his dreams and his habits. Richards played with them, giving answers that were sometimes rational and sometimes bizarre, enjoying the intellectual sparring. The doctors concluded that while he was depraved and lacked moral sense, he was legally sane. He knew the difference between right and wrong. He simply chose to ignore it. This finding removed the last obstacle to a death penalty conviction. January 15, 1879 ended with Richards secure in his cell, the most infamous man in the West. The frenzy of the capture had faded into the grim waiting period before the trial at Minden. January 1, 1879, found Stephen Decatur Richards sitting in the confines of the Kearney jail, a structure of brick and iron that served as his temporary residence while the legal machinery of Nebraska ground slowly into gear. The cell was cold, the stone walls radiating a chill that the small stove in the corridor could not fully combat, but Richards appeared immune to the discomfort. He sat on the edge of his cot, a sheaf of papers in his hand, reading the sensationalized accounts of his own life that were being printed in the local and national newspapers. He read the descriptions of himself as a fiend and a monster with a detached, critical eye, often correcting the journalists aloud to an empty room when they got a date or a detail wrong. The notoriety he had achieved was absolute. He was no longer a farm laborer or a drifter, but a celebrity of the darkest variety. A man whose name was spoken in hushed tones from the Missouri River to the Rocky Mountains. During the first week of January, the jail became a hub of morbid tourism. The sheriff allowed visitors to walk past the cell block to view the prisoner, charging a small fee or simply granting access to the influential citizens of the city. Men brought their wives and daughters to stare at the handsome young man who had confessed to slaughtering a family. Richards did not hide in the shadows. He stood at the bars, dressed in the clean shirt he had bartered for, and engaged the visitors in polite conversation. He answered their questions with a terrifying candor, discussing the mechanics of the axe and the spade as if he were explaining a new method of harvesting corn. He sold autographs and small carte de visite photographs of himself, pocketing the coins to purchase cigars and better food, turning his incarceration into a profitable enterprise. The legal jurisdiction for the trial remained a point of contention throughout early January. The crimes had been committed in Kearney County, a jurisdiction that was still raw and undeveloped, lacking a secure facility to hold a prisoner of Richards' reputation. The authorities in Omaha argued for a trial in the city, citing safety concerns and the risk of mob violence in the rural areas. However, the residents of Kearney and the surrounding settlements demanded that justice be served on the soil where the blood was spilled. Judge William Gaslin, a man known throughout the state for his severe demeanor and strict adherence to the law, ultimately issued the order. Richards was to be transported back to the Minden area, the judicial seat for Kearney County, to face a jury of his peers. On January 14th, the preparations for the transfer began. The journey was fraught with danger, not from the prisoner, who remained docile and cooperative, but from the public. Rumors of a lynching party organizing along the rail line were persistent. Sheriff Martin and a strengthened posse of deputies were assigned to the transport detail. They moved Richards in the dead of night, shackling his hands and feet with heavy irons that clanked against the floorboards of the wagon. They boarded a special train car, the blinds drawn tight, and surrounded the prisoner with Winchesters and shotguns. Richards sat in the center of the armed circle, smoking a cigar, seemingly more amused than frightened by the elaborate security measures taken to preserve his life for the hangman. The train arrived at the depot near Minden on January 15th. The scene was chaotic. Despite the secrecy, word of the arrival had leaked, and a crowd of hundreds had gathered in the freezing mud. These were not the curious city folk of Omaha. These were the hard-bitten homesteaders of the plains, men who knew the Harrelson family and Peter Anderson. They carried ropes and looked at the train car with hard, hateful eyes. The sheriff's men moved quickly, forming a wedge to push through the throng. Richards was hustled into a waiting carriage. The door slammed shut just as a surge of bodies pressed against the vehicle. The driver whipped the horses and the carriage lurched forward, leaving the angry shouts of the mob fading in the winter wind. Richards was housed in a makeshift cell in Minden, as the town lacked a permanent jail strong enough to hold him. A heavy guard was posted 24 hours a day with orders to shoot anyone who attempted to breach the perimeter, whether to free the prisoner or to kill him. Inside this temporary fortress, Richards spent the remainder of the day conferring with the legal counsel appointed to him. The lawyers, men who had taken the case out of obligation rather than ambition, found their client to be maddeningly indifferent to his defense. Richards refused to plead insanity despite the advice of the attorneys who saw it as the only way to avoid the rope. He insisted that he was sane, that his actions were rational choices made to secure property and remove obstacles. January 15, 1879, brought a thaw to the frozen ground, turning the roads of Minden into quagmires of black mud. The district court convened in a building that served multiple purposes for the community, cleared out and arranged with benches to serve as a hall of justice. Judge Gaslin presided from a raised platform, his face set in a permanent scowl. The courtroom was packed to capacity, the air thick with the smell of wet wool, tobacco smoke, and unwashed bodies. Every seat was taken, and men stood 3 deep along the walls, craning their necks to see the defendant. Richards was brought in, his chains rattling, and seated at a small table. He looked around the room, nodding to familiar faces in the crowd, treating the proceedings with the casual air of a social gathering. The jury selection process began on January 15th, but it was a formality that bordered on farce. Richards had already confessed to the press, to the sheriff, and to anyone who would listen. Finding 12 men in Kearney County who had not heard of the case and formed an opinion was a statistical impossibility. The defense attorneys went through the motions, challenging a few potential jurors, but Richards often interrupted them, stating that he was satisfied with the men in the box. He wanted the trial to proceed. He wanted the stage. By the afternoon of January 15th, the jury was impaneled, 12 solemn men who looked at the defendant with a mixture of fear and revulsion. The trial proper commenced on January 15th. The prosecutor, a man named Schofield, opened the case by laying out the timeline of the atrocities. He spoke of the Harrelson family, describing Mary and the 3 children, painting a picture of their isolation and their vulnerability. He described the arrival of Richards, the wolf in sheep's clothing, and the methodical way he had insinuated himself into their lives. Richards listened to the opening statement with his chin resting on his hand, occasionally shaking his head when the prosecutor used a particularly flowery adjective, but otherwise remaining silent. The first witnesses were the men who had uncovered the bodies in the haystack. They took the stand, their voices trembling slightly as they recounted the day of the excavation. They described the frozen earth, the layers of hay, and the moment the shovel struck the quilt. They described the condition of the bodies, the crushed skulls, and the way the children were packed around their mother. The courtroom was silent save for the scratching of the court reporter's pen and the occasional stifled sob from a woman in the gallery. Richards watched the witnesses, his expression blank. He did not look away when the details of the injuries were read. He stared directly at the men speaking, his blue eyes unblinking. When the physical evidence was presented, the atmosphere in the room tightened. The axe, rusted and stained, was placed on the evidence table. The spade, with its heavy iron blade, was laid next to it. These were common tools found on every farm in the county, but in this context they were artifacts of supreme violence. The prosecutor held up the axe, showing the jury the blunt pole of the head that had delivered the fatal blows. Richards leaned forward, interested, as if seeing an old friend. He whispered to his lawyer, correcting a detail about the weight of the tool, a comment that the attorney ignored with a shudder. On January 15th, the prosecution rested its case. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony damning. The defense, having no witnesses to call who could contradict the facts, decided to put Richards himself on the stand. It was a risky maneuver, usually avoided in capital cases, but Richards insisted. He wanted to speak. He took the oath, swearing to tell the truth, and sat in the witness chair. The room went deathly quiet. This was the moment the crowd had waited for, to hear the monster speak in his own defense. Richards did not offer a defense in the traditional sense. He offered a narrative. He spoke in a clear, calm voice, projecting to the back of the room. He described the morning of November 1st, 1879, with a chilling lack of emotion. He explained that he had decided to kill the family because it was the most efficient way to acquire the property. He described the order of the killings: Mary first, then the children, explaining his tactical choices. "I used the axe because it was there," he said simply. "It was quick. They did not suffer." He spoke of the children not as victims, but as sources of noise that needed to be silenced to prevent discovery. The jury listened, mesmerized and horrified. The judge leaned forward, staring at the man who spoke of murder as if it were a business transaction. Richards went on to describe the killing of Peter Anderson, maintaining his story of the fight but admitting that he had intended to poison the man first. He described the failure of the strychnine and his resort to the spade. He claimed he had no animosity toward Anderson, just a need for his money and his silence. "He was a strong man," Richards noted. "He took a lot of killing." The cross-examination by the prosecutor was brief. There was no need to trap Richards in a lie. He was freely offering truths that were more damaging than any falsehood. The prosecutor asked him if he felt any remorse for the death of the little girl, Mabel. Richards paused, thinking. "No," he answered finally. "It was necessary. If I had left her, she would have cried. Neighbors would have come." The logic was internal, circular, and impenetrable. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was explaining a methodology. On January 15th, the closing arguments were delivered. The prosecutor called for the ultimate penalty, pointing to the cold-blooded nature of the crimes and the danger Richards posed to any civilized society. The defense attorney made a half-hearted plea for life imprisonment, citing the possibility of a mental defect, though he knew his client had undermined that argument with his lucid testimony. The case was handed to the jury in the late afternoon. They did not need long. They retreated to the deliberation room, a small office at the back of the building, and returned in less than 2 hours. The verdict was read on January 15th. Richard stood, his hands clasped behind his back. The foreman of the jury, a farmer with a sun-weathered face, stood up and read the decision. "Guilty of murder in the first degree." The words hung in the air. The crowd let out a collective breath, a sound that was half sigh, half growl. Richards did not flinch. He nodded to the judge, accepting the verdict as a foregone conclusion. He sat back down, turning to his lawyer to ask if this meant the trial was over. The sentencing phase was scheduled for later in the month, allowing time for the legal paperwork to be finalized. Richards was returned to his cell, where he continued to hold court. He received letters from across the country, some proposing marriage, others threatening him with eternal damnation. He answered the ones that interested him, often asking for money in exchange for a reply. He seemed to view the verdict not as a condemnation but as a certification of his status. He was officially a murderer now, recognized by the state. January 15, 1879 was the date set for sentencing. Judge Gaslin ordered Richards to stand. The judge spoke at length, his voice booming in the small room. He denounced Richards' actions, calling them the most atrocious he had witnessed in his career on the bench. He spoke of the betrayal of hospitality, the slaughter of the innocent, and the utter lack of human feeling displayed by the defendant. Richards listened politely, looking the judge in the eye. "Stephen Decatur Richards," Judge Gaslin intoned, "it is the judgment of this court that you be taken from this place to a place of confinement. And there, on the 26th day of April, in the year of our Lord 1879, between the hours of 10 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon, you be hanged by the neck until you are dead." The judge paused, letting the weight of the sentence settle. "And may God have mercy on your soul." Richard smiled slightly. "I am ready, Your Honor," he replied. "I have played my hand and I will pay the bet." There was no trembling, no begging for a stay of execution. He accepted the date, April 26th, as a simple appointment on his calendar. He was led out of the courtroom, the crowd parting to let him pass, looking at him with a mixture of hatred and awe. The weeks following the sentencing from late January into April were a time of preparation. The town of Minden began to construct the gallows. It was to be a public execution, a spectacle to demonstrate the power of the law. The structure was built in an open area, designed to be visible to thousands. Richards, from his cell window, could hear the sound of the hammers and saws. He asked the jailer about the construction, inquiring about the type of wood being used and the height of the drop. He offered advice on the rope, suggesting that it be boiled to take out the stretch, ensuring a clean break of the neck. During early April, Richards spent his time writing a final statement and settling his affairs. He sold the rights to his biography to a newspaperman dictating the final chapters of his life story. He wanted to ensure that his version of events was the one that survived. He spoke of his childhood, his travels, and his crimes, weaving a narrative that placed him at the center of the universe. He showed no fear of death. To him, death was simply the cessation of consciousness, a long sleep without dreams. On April 15th, the governor of Nebraska signed the death warrant confirming the date. There would be no reprieve. The legal avenues were exhausted. Richards received the news with a shrug. He continued to eat heartily, gaining weight during his confinement. He slept soundly every night, untroubled by the ghosts of the Harlesons or Anderson. He told the guards that he was looking forward to the end, that the waiting was the only punishment he found difficult to bear. Visitors continued to flock to the jail. One woman asked him why he had killed the baby Jasper. Richards looked at her with genuine puzzlement. "I told you," he said. "He was loud. I needed quiet." The absolute disconnect between his reasoning and human morality was a chasm that no one could bridge. He was a specimen of a different species, a predator living among prey, and the prey was finally banding together to destroy him. As the date approached, the town of Minden swelled with people. Wagons arrived from Texas, Kansas, and Wyoming. Peddlers set up stalls selling food and tonics. The execution of the Nebraska Fiend was to be a carnival of death. Richards knew this and seemed pleased. He told the sheriff that he hoped for a large crowd, stating that a man should have an audience for his final performance. April 24th, 1879, 2 days before the end. Richards was measured for his burial suit. He requested a black suit, white shirt, and a tie. He wanted to look his best. He joked with the tailor, telling him not to make the collar too tight, as the rope would take care of that. The gallows was finished, a stark wooden skeleton rising against the blue prairie sky. A stockade fence was built around it to control the crowd, but the upper platform was visible to all. On April 25th, the day before the execution, Richards ate his final supper. He ordered a substantial meal and consumed every bite. He spent the evening smoking cigars and talking with the guards. He expressed no regret. He wrote a final letter to his parents in Ohio, a letter that was devoid of apology, simply stating that his luck had run out. He went to bed early, telling the jailer to wake him at dawn so he wouldn't be late for his own hanging. The judgment of men had been rendered. The law had spoken, the jury had decided, and the judge had sentenced. Stephen Decatur Richards had been weighed in the balance and found wanting. He lay on his cot on the night of April 25th, the last night of his life, listening to the murmurs of the gathering crowd outside. He was the most famous man in the state, the center of attention, the protagonist of the tragedy. And as he drifted off to sleep, the rope waited in the storehouse, coiled and ready to deliver the final verdict. April 26, 1879, dawned over Kearny County with a sky of brilliant, piercing blue, the kind of limitless canopy that usually signaled the promise of spring on the high plains. However, on this specific Saturday, the attention of the populace was not fixed on the planting of corn or the calving of cattle, but on a crude wooden structure rising from the earth just outside the town of Minden. The sun had barely cleared the eastern horizon when the roads leading into the settlement became choked with traffic. Wagons, buggies, and riders on horseback poured in from every direction, kicking up clouds of dust that hung in the still air like a low fog. They came from as far away as Texas and Illinois, drawn by the telegraph reports and the lurid newspaper headlines that promised the end of the Nebraska Fiend. The atmosphere was not one of solemn justice, but of a festive, macabre carnival. Men in their Sunday best stood shoulder to shoulder with rough-hewn cowhands, while women in bonnets held up children to get a better view of the killing ground. Stephen Decatur Richards awoke in his cell for the final time just as the light began to turn the gray stone walls a pale yellow. He had slept soundly, a feat that baffled the guards who had spent the night playing cards and glancing nervously at the prisoner. Richards rose from his cot and stretched, his joints popping in the quiet room. He washed his face in the basin of cold water, scrubbing the sleep from his eyes with the same methodical care he had used to clean the floor of the Harlson soddy. He did not look like a man facing oblivion. He looked like a man preparing for a business appointment. He requested his breakfast, and when it arrived, a heavy plate of eggs, bacon, and coffee, he ate with a steady hand and a hearty appetite. He commented to the jailer that the coffee was good and strong, a small pleasure to start the day. At 9 in the morning, the tailor arrived with the suit Richards had ordered. It was a black wool suit, cut to fit his frame, accompanied by a crisp white shirt and a black tie. Richards dressed slowly, buttoning the shirt to the neck and adjusting the cuffs. He smoothed the lapels of the coat, checking his reflection in the small mirror. He wanted to die looking like a gentleman, a final act of vanity that served as a barrier against the degradation of the gallows. He combed his hair, parting it neatly, and even trimmed his fingernails. The guards watched him with a mixture of revulsion and awe. Most men they had seen go to the rope were weeping wrecks or trembling cowards, but Richards possessed a terrifying composure that made him seem almost alien. Outside, the crowd had swelled to a size that the local authorities had never anticipated. Estimates placed the number at over 2,000 people, a massive gathering for a frontier territory. The sheriff of Kearny County, anxious about the possibility of a riot or a rescue attempt, had erected a large stockade fence around the base of the gallows. This enclosure was meant to keep the spectators at a distance, but the platform itself was raised high enough that the drop would be visible to all. The noise of the crowd was a constant low roar, a sound composed of thousands of conversations, the whinnying of horses and the shouts of vendors selling tonics and pies. It was a spectacle of the American West, a collision of civilization and savagery, where the law was enforced through public termination. At 10 o'clock, the door to Richard's cell swung open. Sheriff Martin stood there, looking pale and grim. He held a pair of heavy leather straps in his hand. "It is time, Stephen," Martin said, his voice tight. Richards nodded, stepping out of the cell without being touched. He held his arms out, allowing the sheriff to bind his elbows behind his back. The leather creaked as it was tightened, restricting his movement but leaving his hands free for the moment. Richards tested the bonds, shrugging his shoulders. "Tight enough," he remarked. He walked out of the jail building and into the bright sunlight, blinking against the glare. A wagon waited to transport him to the execution site, surrounded by a phalanx of deputies armed with Winchester rifles. Richards climbed into the wagon bed with assistance, sitting on a wooden bench. As the wagon lurched forward, the crowd surged against the police lines. A roar went up, a wave of sound that washed over the prisoner. "There he is!" someone shouted. "Hang the killer!" Richards looked out at the sea of faces. He saw hatred, curiosity, and excitement. He did not lower his eyes. He scanned the crowd, recognizing faces he had seen in the courtroom or during his time in the area. He nodded to a few, a gesture that infuriated the onlookers. He seemed to be enjoying the attention, feeding off the energy of the mob. The ride to the gallows was short, less than a mile, but it felt like a procession through a gauntlet. The dust clogged the air, coating Richard's polished black boots. He leaned over to the deputy sitting next to him. "That is a fine-looking horse," he said, pointing to a mount in the crowd. The deputy stared at him, unable to comprehend how a man minutes from death could notice livestock. Richards was entirely in the present moment, his mind uncluttered by fear of the hereafter. He had accepted his fate weeks ago. The actual event was merely a formality to be endured. The wagon halted at the gate of the stockade. Richards was helped down, his movement stiff due to the restraints. He walked through the gate and saw the gallows towering above him. It was a structure of fresh pine, the wood still yellow and bleeding resin. The rope hung from the crossbeam, a thick coil of hemp ending in a heavy noose. The wind swayed the rope slightly, the only movement in the rigid frame. Richards looked up at the trapdoor, evaluating the construction. He walked up the 13 steps to the platform, his boots thumping hollowly on the wooden stairs. He did not stumble. He did not hesitate. He ascended with the dignity of a man climbing a podium to accept an award. On the platform, the view was expansive. Richards could see for miles across the Nebraska prairie. He saw the rolling hills, the distant line of the Platte River, and the sod houses scattered like small brown islands in the grass. It was the landscape he had terrorized, the vast emptiness that had hidden his crimes. Now it was the stage for his exit. He turned to face the crowd. The noise dropped instantly. 2,000 people held their breath, waiting for his final words. The silence was heavy, broken only by the snapping of a flag in the wind. Sheriff Martin stepped forward, his hands trembling slightly as he approached the prisoner. "Do you have anything to say?" the sheriff asked. Richards looked at the crowd, his blue eyes clear and cold. He spoke in a voice that carried across the enclosure. "I have made my peace with the world," he said, his tone devoid of the trembling vibrato usually heard in such moments. "I am ready to go. I hope my death satisfies you." He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not apologize to the families of the Harlesons or Peter Anderson. He simply acknowledged the transaction. His life for theirs. The sheriff moved to place the black hood over Richard's head. It was a simple sack of dark cloth designed to hide the contortions of the face during the dying process. Richards accepted the darkness without flinching. "Don't choke me with the rope," he mumbled from beneath the fabric. Put the knot where it belongs. The sheriff adjusted the noose, sliding the heavy knot behind Richard's left ear. This placement was critical. It was intended to snap the neck upon impact, severing the spinal cord and causing instant unconsciousness. If the knot slipped, the prisoner would strangle slowly. The rough hemp scratched against Richard's skin, a final tactile sensation, before the end. The sheriff stepped back, signaling the deputies to move away from the trapdoor. Richard stood alone in the center of the platform, a black column against the blue sky. He stood perfectly still, his breathing invisible beneath the coat. The crowd below watched with a collective intensity, their eyes fixed on the wooden lever that protruded from the floorboards. The executioner, a man whose face was pale with the weight of his duty, placed his hand on the iron handle. He looked at the sheriff for the signal. Martin nodded once, a sharp downward motion of his head. The executioner pulled the lever. The sound of the bolt sliding back was a sharp metallic clack, followed immediately by the loud bang of the heavy wooden trapdoors swinging down and hitting the stops. Richards dropped. Gravity claimed him instantly. His body plummeted through the opening, falling the calculated distance of 6 feet. The rope went taut with a violent snapping sound that echoed like a gunshot across the prairie. The sudden stop exerted massive force on the neck structures. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of air that hissed through the enclosure. Richard's body hung suspended in the air, swaying slightly from the momentum of the fall. The neck had been broken by the drop, the vertebrae dislocating and severing the connection between the brain and the body. However, the heart continued to beat for a time, driving blood through a system that no longer had a captain. The body twitched, the legs jerking in a macabre dance known as the hangman's jig. This was not a conscious struggle, but the firing of dying nerves. The chest heaved spasmodically as the lungs tried to draw air against the crushed windpipe. To the observers, it looked like a desperate fight for life, but Richards was already gone, lost in the black void he had courted for so long. The doctors, who had been waiting at the bottom of the scaffold, stepped forward as the swaying diminished. They pulled out gold pocket watches, timing the fading of the pulse. One doctor placed his hand on Richard's wrist, feeling the slow, thumping rhythm of the heart gradually slowing down. "Pulse is strong," he announced to the sheriff. Minutes ticked by. The sun beat down on the black hood. The crowd began to murmur again, the tension releasing into morbid commentary. They discussed the drop, the knot, the way the body hung. It was a technical critique of death. After 15 minutes, the doctor at the wrist looked up. "The pulse has ceased," he declared. He placed a stethoscope against the chest, listening for the faintest echo of life. There was only silence. "He is dead," the doctor pronounced. The time was noted, 1 o'clock and 17 minutes in the afternoon. The Nebraska Fiend was no more. The physical vessel that had contained the cold intelligence of Stephen Decatur Richards was now just 160 pounds of dead weight hanging from a rope. The sheriff ordered the body to be cut down. A deputy climbed a ladder and slashed the rope with a knife. The body was lowered carefully into a plain pine coffin that had been placed beneath the trapdoor. The black hood was removed, revealing a face that was purple and swollen from blood congestion, the tongue protruding slightly between the teeth. The handsome features were distorted, the charm erased by the violence of the state. The eyes, once so unsettlingly blue, were half open and glazed, staring at nothing. The suit he had put on that morning was brushed clean of dust before the lid was nailed shut. The crowd began to disperse, the show having concluded. They climbed back into their wagons and mounted their horses, beginning the long journey home. They spoke of the hanging with a sense of satisfaction. Justice had been done. The monster was dead. But underneath the satisfaction there was a lingering unease. They had seen a man die who showed no fear, no regret, and no humanity. It challenged their understanding of evil. They wanted him to scream, to beg, to show that he was human. His silence was his final victory. The body of Stephen Decatur Richards was not given a Christian burial. It was claimed by the doctors for medical study, a common practice for executed criminals of the era. They wanted to open his skull and examine his brain, searching for a physical cause for his moral depravity. They would find nothing, no tumor, no lesion, no deformity. The evil was not in the gray matter, it was in the soul or the lack thereof. His bones would eventually be scattered, his grave unmarked, his physical existence erased just as he had erased the Harlesons. As the sun began to set on April 26th, the town of Minden quieted down. The gallows stood empty, a grim silhouette against the red sky. The wind picked up, rustling the prairie grass where Richards had once stalked his victims. The execution marked a turning point for the region. The wild, lawless days of the open frontier were ending. The arrival of the law, the court, and the hangman signaled the closing of the era of the drifter. Families could sleep slightly sounder in their sod houses, but the memory of the polite young man with the hammer would haunt the collective memory of Nebraska for generations. Richards had proven that the greatest danger on the plains was not the wolf, the blizzard, or the hostile warrior, but the smiling stranger who sat at your table. He had changed the way people looked at the horizon. The trust that had been the bedrock of frontier survival, the open door to the traveler, was fractured. The legacy of Stephen Decatur Richards was not just the graves he dug, but the shadow he cast over the hospitality of the West. As night fell completely, the rope was coiled and put away, but the darkness that Richards represented remained, a cold undercurrent in the history of the American expansion.